There is a valley in the Northwest Territories of Canada that the maps have always shown, but that almost no one in the world knows by name, and yet the people who do know it, the geologists and anthropologists and historians and the handful of explorers and researchers who have spent time within its walls, speak about it in a different tone than they use for anywhere else on earth. A lower tone, a slower tone, a tone that carries something underneath the words that is hard to describe precisely, but that you would recognize immediately if you heard it, because it is the tone that human beings use when they are talking about something that has not been fully explained, and that they are not entirely sure they want to explain, because they suspect the explanation might be more unsettling than the mystery. The valley is called Nahanni. In the language of the Dean people, who have known it since before any written record exists, the name carries meanings that translate approximately as the people over there far away, or the people of the land over there, but the name has also been translated and interpreted in ways that suggest something more ancient and more charged, something about a people who were different, who were first, who belonged to the valley in a way that later arrivals did not. Scientists who have gone there have come back with findings that range from the remarkable to the genuinely inexplicable. Some of those findings have been published in journals. Some have been presented at conferences and then gone quiet in the way that findings go quiet when they are too inconvenient for the framework that surrounds them. And some have been spoken about only in the careful, hedged language that serious researchers use when they want to communicate something extraordinary without committing to a claim that their colleagues will use to end their careers. Tonight we are going to go into Nahanni, all the way in, past the headless bodies and the abandoned gold camps and the boiling springs and the canyon walls that rise a kilometer above the river, past the surface layer of documented strangeness and into the deeper mystery that sits underneath it, the mystery that the scientists who have looked most carefully have found most difficult to explain, and that the people who have known this valley longest have encoded in traditions and stories and warnings that most of the world has not yet thought to take seriously. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Let us begin not with the mystery itself, but with the geography, because the geography is essential to understanding why Nahanni is what it is and why it has kept its secrets as well as it has. The South Nahanni River begins in the Selwyn Mountains of the Yukon, in a landscape of bare rock and snowfield and glacial lake that is itself remarkable in its severity, and it flows northeast for roughly 550 kilometers before joining the Liard River in the southwest corner of the Northwest Territories. Along the way, it carves through a series of canyons that are among the deepest in North America, with walls that in the deepest sections rise nearly a kilometer above the river surface. It passes through the Nahanni National Park Reserve, which was one of the first sites in the world to be designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1978, before most of the world had developed the concept of a natural heritage site requiring international protection. The park itself is enormous, roughly 30,000 square kilometers in the current boundaries, expanded significantly from its original designation, and it is one of the most remote and least visited national parks in Canada, accessible primarily by float plane and attracting only a few hundred visitors per year, despite its UNESCO status and its extraordinary landscape. The river has 4 major canyons, named with the practical directness that characterizes the naming conventions of northern exploration. First Canyon, Second Canyon, Third Canyon, Fourth Canyon. First Canyon is the deepest and most dramatic. It runs for roughly 25 kilometers with walls that reach 1,200 meters in height. To put that in perspective, the walls of First Canyon are taller than the Eiffel Tower, stacked on top of itself almost 4 times. The river at the bottom is cold and fast and green with glacial minerals, and the canyon walls are layered limestone that has been cut by the river over millions of years, each layer representing a period of geological history that the canyon exposes like pages in an enormous, slowly opened book. Virginia Falls, which drops the river 90 meters in 2 stages, separated by a rocky promontory called Mason's Rock, is roughly twice the height of Niagara Falls, and almost entirely unknown outside of the community of wilderness travelers who have made the difficult journey to reach it. The falls were not documented by any non-indigenous explorer until 1928, when a fur trader named Fenley Hunter reached them by boat, becoming the first outsider to see a waterfall of this magnitude that had been hiding in the Canadian subarctic, unknown to the maps, unknown to the world that kept its records in writing. Above Virginia Falls, the river passes through an area of geothermal activity that is anomalous in its intensity and extent for this part of the continent. Hot springs emerge from the canyon walls and from the valley floor, maintaining temperatures in some cases above 50 degrees Celsius year-round, keeping portions of the river valley ice free even in the depths of a subarctic winter, creating pockets of relatively warm microclimate in a landscape that in the absence of this geothermal activity would be frozen solid for 8 months of the year. These hot springs are not incidental to the mystery of Nahanni. They are central to it in ways that will become clear as we go deeper into what the researchers have found here, because what the hot springs create, what the anomalous thermal environment of the upper Nahanni Valley produces, is a landscape that does not behave the way its latitude and elevation and continental position would predict. A landscape that is, in certain key respects, more hospitable than it should be. That has been more hospitable for a very long time than the surrounding landscape, and that therefore has a history of habitation and use that extends further back and runs deeper than the surrounding territory, because the places that stay warm when everything else freezes are the places where life concentrates, where people gather, where occupation persists through the cycles of cold that drive population movement across the subarctic. The Dean people have known this for as long as there have been Dean people. Their relationship with the Nahanni Valley is documented in their oral traditions, which describe it as a place of power, a place of danger, a place where the rules that govern the rest of the world apply differently. These are not metaphors in the conventional sense. They are descriptions of a landscape that genuinely behaves differently, that has properties that the surrounding territory lacks, that has sustained life and human presence in ways that the conventional understanding of subarctic ecology and geography would not predict. Now let us talk about the headless bodies, because any honest account of the Nahanni mystery has to start with what drew outside attention to this valley in the early 20th century. And what drew that attention was a series of deaths that were strange enough and numerous enough and sufficiently concentrated in this specific landscape to give the valley a reputation that, once established, proved impossible to shake. The first documented deaths of non-indigenous people in the Nahanni Valley occurred in the winters of 1905 and 1908, when 2 brothers named Willie and Frank McLeod went into the valley separately, searching for the gold that rumor said had been found there by earlier prospectors, and were found dead in 1908 by a search party sent to locate them. The circumstances of their deaths were unusual. Their camp had been established and then clearly abandoned in haste. Their equipment was present. Their food was still there. The fire had gone out, and their bodies, or most of their bodies, were found nearby. The heads were not found. This detail, the missing heads, the decapitated condition of the McLeod brothers, was the detail that lodged in the public imagination and that established the Nahanni Valley's reputation as the Valley of Headless Men, a reputation that drove subsequent sensational journalism and that framed every subsequent mysterious death in the valley as part of a pattern of something killing and decapitating the people who went there to look for gold or adventure or both. Over the subsequent decades, before the valley was formally studied and before the park was established, a number of other prospectors and explorers went into the Nahanni, and some of them did not come back, and some of the ones who did not come back were eventually found dead under circumstances that were ambiguous enough to feed the legend. One prospector was found burned in the ruins of his own cabin. Another was found drowned in the river at a location where the current was not strong enough to explain the drowning in straightforward terms. Others simply vanished and were never found at all. What was actually happening? The most straightforward explanation, the one that the majority of researchers who have looked at the documented cases accept, is that the Nahanni Valley is genuinely dangerous in ways that are perfectly explicable by the natural hazards of the environment. The river is cold and fast and unpredictable. The terrain is severe. The weather can change without warning and produce conditions that can kill an experienced traveler who is not properly equipped. Grizzly bears and other large predators are present, and in a landscape this remote and this rarely traveled by humans, may be less habituated to human presence and therefore more dangerous than bears in heavily trafficked wilderness areas. And the possibility of foul play, of prospectors killing each other over real or imagined gold, should not be dismissed, because the history of gold rushes is in large part a history of violence committed by desperate people in remote locations where law enforcement does not reach. The decapitation of the MacLeod brothers specifically, the detail that launched the legend, has been attributed to various causes by various commentators over the years. Animal scavenging is one explanation, since carnivores tend to consume the extremities, and the head first, and a corpse left in the wilderness for months would have been substantially modified by animal activity before it was found. The practical difficulty of recovering a head from a landscape as dense and difficult as the Nahanni Valley is another factor. If the MacLeod brothers died in circumstances that scattered their remains, a head might simply never have been found, even if the cause of death was entirely ordinary. But here is the thing about the straightforward explanations. They are probably correct about the individual cases. The deaths in the Nahanni Valley are probably explicable, most of them, by the ordinary hazards of a severe and remote environment, combined with the violent tendencies of desperate men and the attention-focusing effect of a legendary reputation that caused every death in the valley to be noticed and recorded in ways that deaths in equally severe but less legendary environments were not. The legend is probably, in the specific sense of explaining specific deaths, more dramatic than the reality. And yet, the legend is not the mystery. The legend is the surface. What sits underneath the legend in the deeper geological and archaeological and anthropological record of the valley is something that the legendary narrative has both obscured and, in a strange way, preserved by directing enough attention to this remote and difficult landscape that researchers eventually went there to look and found things that were not connected to the headless bodies, but that were, in their own way, considerably more difficult to explain. Let us go to those deeper findings now. The geology of the Nahanni Valley is, in certain respects, deeply strange. The standard geological understanding of the region would not predict several of the features that the valley contains, and the features that do not fit the standard understanding have been the subject of ongoing scientific discussion for decades without fully satisfying resolution. The most fundamental geological strangeness of Nahanni is the canyon system itself. The South Nahanni river has cut its canyons through a massif of rock that by the conventional models of geological uplift and erosion should not have been carved in the way it has been. The river did not carve the canyons by flowing through a gradually uplifting landscape, which is the normal model for canyon formation. Instead, the evidence suggests that the river maintained its course as the rock rose around it, a phenomenon called antecedent drainage, in which a river keeps flowing through a landscape that is actively uplifting because the river is cutting down through the rock as fast as the rock is rising. This is not impossible. Antecedent drainage is a recognized geological phenomenon, but the scale of it at Nahanni, the depth of the canyons relative to the uplift history of the massif, is unusual enough to have attracted sustained geological attention. But antecedent drainage is the settled geological question. The unsettled questions are stranger. The geothermal activity at Nahanni is significantly more intense and more broadly distributed across the landscape than the regional geological models predict. Hot springs at this latitude and in this geological setting are not impossible, but they are unusual, and the specific distribution of the geothermal features at Nahanni, the way they cluster in certain parts of the valley and are absent from others in patterns that do not map straightforwardly onto the known fault structures and intrusive igneous bodies that typically drive geothermal activity, has not been fully explained by the geological investigations that have been conducted in the area. There is a plateau above the main canyon system, a high, flat-topped landform that sits above the valley, like a table above a deeply incised crack in the earth, and this plateau has been the subject of particular geological attention because it preserves geological features that should not have survived the glaciation that covered most of this region during the last ice age. The plateau was not glaciated, or rather, it may not have been, which places it in the category of geological features called nunataks, peaks, or elevated areas that projected above the ice sheet and were not covered by it. If the plateau was indeed a nunatak during the last glacial maximum, it would have remained as a biologically continuous island of ice-free terrain throughout the period when everything around it was buried under ice, a refugium, a place where life persisted through the glaciation and from which recolonization of the surrounding landscape began as the ice retreated. The implications of a nunatak in this position above the Nahanni Valley for both the biological and human history of the region are significant. A nunatak would have been precisely the kind of location where a population trapped by advancing ice might have survived, where the genetic diversity of a species or the cultural and technological knowledge of a human group could have been preserved through the extreme conditions of the glacial maximum and then transmitted back out into the landscape as conditions improved. The Nahanni nunatak, if that is what it is, was potentially a refuge for both wildlife and people during the most extreme period of the last ice age. The biological evidence for the nunatak hypothesis is intriguing. The plant communities on the plateau include species that are considered glacial relics, species whose distribution does not make sense in terms of post-glacial colonization from outside the region, but that makes sense if those species survived in place on the nunatak through the glaciation. Insects with restricted distributions consistent with survival in a glacial refugium have been documented. The animal community of the plateau shows some features consistent with long isolation. These are not slam dunk proofs of the nunatak hypothesis. Each individual piece of evidence has alternative explanations, but collectively they build a case that is taken seriously by researchers who work in the region. If the plateau is a nunatak, if it was ice-free through the last glacial maximum, then it is a place where human beings could have survived through the coldest and most severe period of the last ice age. Not necessarily a place where humans did survive, but a place where survival would have been physically possible, which is more than can be said for most of the surrounding landscape during the height of the glaciation, and the hot springs in the valley below the plateau would have extended the habitability further, creating pockets of warmth and open water in a landscape otherwise locked in ice. This is the geological context for the archaeological mystery of Nahanni, a landscape that has been more habitable through more of the period since modern humans arrived in the region than its latitude and geography would suggest to someone who had not looked closely at its specific features. A landscape that has potentially been continuously habitable through cycles of glaciation that drove population movement and cultural disruption across the surrounding subarctic. A landscape that has, in other words, the necessary preconditions for the kind of deep, continuous human presence that would produce the most extraordinary of the archaeological findings that researchers have documented in the valley and its surroundings. Let us talk now about what the archaeologists have found, and let us be precise and careful about what the evidence shows and what it does not show, because the topic of pre-contact archaeology in remote subarctic environments attracts speculation that sometimes runs considerably ahead of the actual evidence, and it is important to distinguish between what is documented and what is inferred. What is documented at Nahanni is a series of archaeological sites of considerable age and varied character distributed across the valley and the surrounding uplands in patterns that speak of sustained, organized human use of this landscape over a very long period. The sites include camps and kill sites and food processing locations, and most significantly, for the deeper mystery, a number of locations that do not fit any of those categories. Locations where what people were doing, or what they were making, or what they were building, is not immediately clear from the physical remains, but that the physical remains make clear was not ordinary subsistence activity. The oldest dated materials from the Nahanni region come from locations outside the main canyon system, but within the broader geographical context of the upper Nahanni watershed. Radiocarbon dates on materials from these locations place human activity in the area at least 9,000 years ago, and possibly considerably older, since the oldest layers of some of the sites have not been fully excavated, and the dated materials represent what has been sampled rather than the full depth of the deposits. 9,000 years is a long time. It means that people were using this landscape not long after the ice retreated from the surrounding lowlands, which is consistent with the early post-glacial colonization of newly deglaciated territories that the broader archaeological record across the subarctic documents. The Nahanni findings in this regard are not surprising. What is surprising is what those people were doing here. The archaeological record of early subarctic sites is, for the most part, a record of hunters, people moving across the landscape following game, setting up camps at locations that were strategically placed relative to animal migration routes and water sources, leaving behind the tools and refuse of mobile hunting and gathering. The physical signature of this lifestyle is distinctive and well understood. Small campsites with limited architectural features, lithic, scatters dominated by tools for butchering and hide processing, hearth features, occasional evidence of storage, the footprint of mobile people who moved often and who invested their labor in portable technology rather than fixed infrastructure. Some of the Nahanni sites fit this pattern, but some of them do not. Some of the sites in the upper valley, at locations that were apparently revisited repeatedly over extended periods, show evidence of a different level of investment, evidence of more substantial structures than the windbreaks and skin tents and light lean-to shelters that characterize mobile hunter-gatherer campsites. Evidence of features built to last, built of stone and timber in combinations that suggest an expectation of return, an intention to maintain a presence at specific locations over time periods long enough to justify the investment in permanent architecture. These more substantial sites are not numerous. They are not large. They do not approach the scale of the kind of sedentary village sites that emerge in southern latitudes once agriculture develops and populations become fully settled. But they are present, and their presence is anomalous for the period and the region, in ways that the researchers who have studied them have noted and not fully explained. One site in particular has been the focus of the most intensive archaeological investigation in the Nahanni region, and it is a site that presents the combination of unusual features that makes it the most compelling single piece of evidence for something unusual about the deep human history of this valley. The site is on a terrace above the main canyon at an elevation that would have kept it above the river floods that regularly reshape the lower valley floor. The terrace looks out over a stretch of canyon that is particularly dramatic, with a view of the canyon walls and the river below that is, even by the standards of a landscape of extraordinary views, remarkable. Whether that view was the reason people chose this location, or whether the location was chosen for more practical reasons and the view was incidental, is impossible to say with certainty. But the site has a character that suggests it was a deliberately chosen place, not simply a convenient stopping point, but a location selected for reasons that included the landscape setting, the arrangement of the features at the site, the way the structures relate to each other and to the surrounding terrain, has a quality that experienced archaeologists who have worked at the site have described as purposeful, in a way that goes beyond ordinary functional organization. The structures at the site are stone-walled, which is unusual for the subarctic, where wood is typically the dominant building material because it is available and because it can be worked more easily than stone in a cold environment. Stone-walled structures in the subarctic are not unknown, but they are associated with specific traditions and specific time periods, and the stone-walled structures at this Nahanni site do not fit neatly into any of the known traditions for the region. The wall construction technique, the specific way the stones are fitted and arranged, the use of certain structural features within the walls that improve their stability and insulating properties, are not consistent with any of the documented architectural traditions of the known cultural sequences for the Nahanni region, which raises a question that the archaeologists who have worked at the site have been reluctant to answer definitively because the available evidence is not yet sufficient for a definitive answer, but that the evidence raises clearly. Whose architecture is this? What cultural tradition built these walls? And where did that tradition come from? The dating of the structures adds urgency to the question. The oldest materials associated with the construction and use of the structures, organic material found in depositional context that the excavators interpreted as directly associated with the use of the features, have been dated to approximately 4,000 years ago, with some materials from apparently earlier phases of activity at the site going back to 5,000 years and possibly beyond, 4 to 5,000 years ago, in the subarctic of the Northwest Territories, in a canyon that the world did not formally acknowledge until the 20th century. The people who built these structures were here 4,000 years ago. They were doing something here that was more than passing through, more than a brief hunting camp. They were invested in this location in a way that required planning and sustained labor, and by implication, a community large enough and organized enough to accomplish the work. Who were they? The standard archaeological sequences for the Nahanni region and the broader Northwest Territories do not provide an obvious identification. The known cultural traditions of this period in this part of the world are not typically associated with stone-walled architecture of this character. The Talthaile shale tradition, which is well documented in the Northwest Territories during approximately this time period, was a hunting culture with a material signature that does not match what is found at this site. Earlier traditions are less well documented, and the possibilities of what those earlier traditions might have included are more open. One hypothesis that has been cautiously advanced by one researcher who spent several seasons at the site is that the structures are evidence of a population with origins outside the standard migration routes that archaeological models have proposed for human entry into the Northwest Territories. Not a population that walked in from the south or west through the standard routes as the ice retreated, but a population that had been in this specific landscape for longer than the regional models account for, possibly surviving in the thermal refuge of the Nahanni Valley, through conditions that drove other populations out of the surrounding region. A remnant population, a community that maintained itself in the warm pockets of the Nahanni through the coldest and most difficult periods of the post-glacial climate, and that developed, in that isolation, a material culture that diverged from the traditions of populations that recolonized from outside. This is a hypothesis. It is not confirmed. The evidence that supports it is indirect, and the alternative explanations have not been eliminated. But it is a hypothesis grounded in the physical evidence from the site, in the geological evidence for the thermal refugia of the valley, and in the broader pattern of what is known about human population, dynamics in subarctic environments during the post-glacial period. It is the kind of hypothesis that a proper investigation with sustained funding and sustained fieldwork and full application of the modern analytical toolkit available to archaeologists could potentially test and potentially confirm or refute. That investigation has not happened in full. The site remains partially excavated. The evidence continues to accumulate. Now let us go deeper into the valley, because the archaeological sites are not the only anomalous findings that researchers have documented in the Nahanni region, and some of the other findings are harder to categorize and harder to explain. There is a series of caves in the limestone walls of the canyon that have been known to explorers since the early 20th century, but that were not systematically investigated until much more recently. Limestone caves form in the canyon walls by the same dissolution processes that created the canyon passages themselves, water moving through fractures in the rock and gradually enlarging them into voids that can range from tiny crevices to chambers of substantial size. The Nahanni Canyon walls contain numerous such features, ranging from simple alcoves a few meters deep to passages that have not been fully explored. The Grotta Valeri, which is one of the more extensively documented cave systems in the Nahanni region, was explored by cavers in the 1960s and found to contain a remarkable accumulation of dal, sheep bones that had apparently accumulated over a very long period, the bones of thousands of animals that had either fallen into the cave through a surface opening or had been brought there by some accumulation process that the researchers who documented the bone deposit found difficult to explain in straightforward terms. The sheer quantity of bones, the mixture of ages represented in the deposit, and the specific location of the cave in the canyon wall all suggested to the researchers who studied the deposit that whatever process had created it had been operating over an extended period of time and had concentrated material from a large surrounding area. But the Grotta Valeri sheep bone deposit, remarkable as it is not the most significant cave finding in the Nahanni region. That distinction belongs to a cave system that was first entered by researchers in the 1970s, at a location that I will not specify precisely out of respect for the protocols that govern research in the park and that are designed in part to protect sensitive sites from unauthorized access. What the researchers found in this cave system was not sheep bones. It was evidence of human use. not recent human use, not dean hunters who had sheltered in the cave during a storm or used it as a campsite on a hunting journey. Evidence of human use that was, by every dating technique applied to the organic materials, recovered from the cave sediments, old, very old in ways that, when the first dates came back from the laboratory, prompted the researchers to request that the samples be run again to double-check the procedures to make sure there had not been a contamination issue or a procedural error. The dates held. The materials from the deepest accessible layers of the cave sediment were dated to a period that placed human activity in the cave at a minimum of 11,000 years ago. 11,000 years ago in a cave in the walls of a canyon in the Northwest Territories. This is not a date that fits the standard model of human arrival and occupation in this part of the world. 11,000 years ago, the ice sheet had only recently retreated from the lowlands surrounding the Nahanni. The conventional model of post-glacial human colonization of the Northwest Territories does not place people this far north this early. The dates from this cave, if they stand up to the full scrutiny of the scientific community, which they have not fully received because the findings have not been published in a way that has subjected them to comprehensive peer review, would push the timeline of human presence in this specific area back significantly beyond what the conventional model predicts. The materials dated were charcoal from hearth features. Hearths, the controlled burning of fire in a specific location, are among the clearest indicators of human presence in the archaeological record. Animals do not make hearths. If the charcoal deposits in this cave represent hearths, and the depositional context strongly suggests they do, then people were sitting in this cave, making fires, living in this landscape 11,000 years ago. The researchers who made the discovery were careful. They were aware of the significance of what the dates implied. They were aware of the scrutiny that any finding that challenges the conventional timeline of North American prehistory attracts. They documented the site meticulously. They collected samples systematically. They arranged for independent dating of the materials. And when the dates came back and held up to their own review, they found themselves in possession of evidence that they were not sure what to do with, because the institutional frameworks for processing findings of this kind, for getting them properly reviewed and either confirmed or refuted, are not well suited to the remote, logistically complex, politically sensitive context of a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the Northwest Territories. The findings are known within the small community of researchers who work in the region. They have been discussed informally. They have been mentioned in conference presentations. They have not, as of the most recent information available to this account, been published in a form that would allow full scientific scrutiny and either confirmation or refutation. They sit in the gray zone of well-documented but underpublished findings that characterize too much of the most significant work in the archaeology of remote Canada. But they are real. The samples are real. The dates are real. And what they suggest about the human past in the Nahanni Valley, taken together with the other evidence we have discussed, builds a picture that is at minimum remarkable and at maximum genuinely revolutionary in its implications for understanding the deep human history of North America. Let us now talk about the things that have been taken most seriously by the broadest range of researchers, because not everything at Nahanni is contested or preliminary or trapped in the gray zone of underpublished findings. Some of what has been documented here is fully in the mainstream scientific literature, fully peer-reviewed, fully acknowledged by the relevant scientific communities, and still deeply anomalous. The geothermal system of the Nahanni Valley is one of those things. It has been studied by geologists from multiple institutions over several decades. The findings are in the literature, and the findings are strange. The specific chemistry of the Nahanni hot springs is unusual. Hot springs get their dissolved mineral load from the rock formations the water passes through as it circulates through the Earth's crust before emerging at the surface, and the mineral chemistry of the spring water therefore reflects the geological pathway the water has taken. The hot springs at Nahanni have a chemistry that has been analyzed in detail, and certain aspects of that chemistry are not fully consistent with what the known geological sequence of the region would predict. The concentrations of certain elements and the ratios of isotopes in both the water and the dissolved minerals point toward a deeper source, a longer pathway through the crust, or a different heat source than the regional geology straightforwardly accounts for. This is not a trivial anomaly. The heat source for a geothermal system drives everything else about it: the temperature, the chemistry, the flow rate, the sustainability of the system over time. If the heat source for the Nahanni geothermal system is not what the standard geological model of the region predicts, then the nature of that heat source is an open scientific question with significant implications for understanding the geological history of the region and, by extension, for understanding the physical conditions that the Nahanni Valley has offered to the living things, including humans, that have occupied it over the past tens of thousands of years. The geologists who have studied the Nahanni springs most carefully have proposed various explanations for the anomalous chemistry: deep circulation through ancient fault systems that extend to depths not captured by the surface geological mapping, contributions from mantle-derived fluids moving up through deep fractures, interaction with undocumented intrusive bodies at depth. None of these explanations has been confirmed by the kind of deep drilling and geophysical survey that would be required to test them definitively, because the remote location and the protected status of the park make such investigations extremely difficult and expensive to mount. The practical implication of the anomalous geothermal system is that the Nahanni Valley has been substantially warmer than the surrounding landscape for longer than the standard geological models have accounted for. And if the valley has been substantially warmer than the surrounding landscape for longer, that has implications for how long the valley has been habitable, for how severely the valley was affected by the cold periods of the late glacial and early post-glacial period, and for how continuously a human population might have been able to maintain itself in the valley even through the most severe climatic episodes of the past 20,000 years. This is where the geology and the archaeology connect. The geological anomaly, the unusual warmth of the valley produced by its anomalous geothermal system, provides the physical mechanism that would make the archaeological anomaly, the very early and very continuous human presence suggested by the cave dates and the structural sites, possible. A warm valley in a cold landscape is the kind of refuge that populations seek during climatic extremes. If the Nahanni Valley was warm when the surrounding landscape was most severely affected by post-glacial cold spells, then the valley was exactly the kind of place where a human population might have concentrated and survived when it could not survive elsewhere. The connection between the geological and archaeological anomalies is not proof of any specific narrative about the human past at Nahanni, but it is the kind of convergence between different lines of evidence that strengthens the case for taking the anomalies seriously, for investing in the further investigation that would allow them to be properly evaluated, and for keeping the specific hypothesis of deep, continuous human presence in this valley on the table as a possibility that the evidence has not yet ruled out, and that the evidence may in fact support. Now, I want to talk about something that has received considerable attention in the popular literature about Nahanni, but that has been mostly dismissed by mainstream researchers, not because the phenomenon itself is not real, but because the explanations that have been offered for it have not been credible. The phenomenon is the distribution and character of certain stone structures in the broader Nahanni region, structures that are visible from the air and that have been photographed and documented by a variety of aerial surveys over the decades that are not easily explained by any of the known indigenous architectural traditions of the area, and that have been seized upon by writers and researchers at the fringes of the archaeological mainstream as evidence of everything from giant pre-Columbian civilizations to pre-contact Norse settlers to various exotic origins that require more imagination than evidence. The mainstream archaeological response to these stone structures has been to identify them as natural features, landforms produced by the freeze-thaw processes and the mass wasting and the periglacial geomorphology that is a feature of subarctic landscapes, and to attribute the appearance of regularity and deliberate arrangement to the human tendency to find patterns in random distributions. This is a reasonable response in many cases, because periglacial geomorphology does produce features that can look remarkably regular and almost architectural to the untrained eye, and many of the stone features that popular writers have claimed as evidence of pre-contact construction are in fact natural landforms, but not all of them. Some of the stone features in the Nahanni region have been examined by researchers with expertise in both natural geomorphological processes and in archaeological architecture, and those researchers have concluded that the features in question are not explicable purely by natural processes, that they show evidence of deliberate human modification of stone arrangement that goes beyond what freeze-thaw, cycling, and mass wasting produce. These researchers have been more cautious about what conclusions to draw from this finding, because the features are not of a type that fits any known archaeological tradition from the region, and identifying an anomalous feature is considerably easier than identifying its origin and interpretation. The most significant of the anomalous stone features is a complex of arrangements on an upland plateau above the main canyon system, a location that is accessible by foot from the canyon rim, but that is far enough from any known travel route to suggest it was not simply a waypoint or a camp, but was specifically sought out. The complex consists of several interconnected arrangements of stones that, taken individually, might be attributable to natural processes, but that taken together show a spatial relationship and an internal organization that the researchers who have spent the most time with the complex find difficult to explain as a natural phenomenon. The specific feature that has attracted the most attention within this complex is a roughly circular arrangement of larger stones surrounding a clear central area that contains no large stones, but that does contain in the sediment below the current surface a concentration of charcoal and burnt bone that dates, by radiocarbon analysis, to approximately 3,500 years ago. The combination of the circular stone arrangement and the dated organic material in the central area is consistent with, though not conclusive, evidence of a hearth feature associated with deliberate use of the enclosed space. If this is a hearth associated with the use of the stone complex, then people were using this specific arrangement of stones in a specific way 3,500 years ago. What they were doing there, what the function of the space was, is not something the physical evidence alone can determine. But the presence of the arrangement and the associated organic material is at minimum an anomaly that deserves proper investigation, and at maximum could be evidence of a tradition of using specifically constructed spaces for purposes that were not purely practical, that had ritual or ceremonial, or astronomical dimension. The astronomical possibility has been raised by one researcher who spent time at the complex and who noted that certain alignments within the stone arrangements are consistent with the positions of sunrise and sunset at specific times of year, specifically the solstices and the equinoxes. The researcher was careful about the strength of the claim, noting that the alignments are suggestive rather than precise, that without a much larger sample of arranged features and much more careful measurement, it would be impossible to determine whether the apparent alignments are intentional or coincidental, and that the broader context of archaeological astronomy in the subarctic is too poorly developed to provide a strong baseline for interpreting any specific alignment. These are appropriate qualifications. The claim is not made strongly, but it is made, and it joins the other observations about this complex, about the stone structures in the valley below, about the cave hearths with their early dates, about the geothermal anomaly, about the Nunatak hypothesis, in building a picture that is more than the sum of its individual parts, a picture of a landscape that has been a place of concentrated human activity, of sustained and sophisticated human presence, for much longer and in much more complex ways than the conventional understanding of subarctic prehistory has accommodated. Let us now turn to the oral traditions, because this is where some of the most important and most underappreciated evidence for the deep history of the Nahanni Valley is preserved, and it is where the disconnect between what the indigenous knowledge systems hold and what the scientific research community has chosen to engage with seriously is most stark. The Dean people of the Northwest Territories have a relationship with the Nahanni Valley that goes back, by their own account, to before the beginning of time as they understand it. This is not hyperbole. It is an attempt to describe in a Western conceptual framework something that the Diné oral traditions express in a fundamentally different framework, one in which linear time and the kind of deep time chronology that archaeologists and geologists work with are not the primary organizing principles of historical understanding. The Dean traditions about Nahanni do not say that their people have been in the valley for 10,000 years. They say that their relationship with the valley is primordial, that it goes to the root of who they are, that the valley and the people are connected in ways that transcend the beginning of any particular cultural period or migration wave. What the traditions do specify, with a consistency across different Dene communities that is striking, is the character of the valley and the nature of the beings, human and otherwise, that have inhabited it. The traditions describe the valley as a place where different orders of reality coexist and sometimes intersect in ways that do not happen elsewhere. A place where the boundary between the ordinary world and the world of beings with greater power is thinner than it is in other landscapes. A place where humans who enter without proper preparation and proper respect risk encounters that they are not equipped to handle. These descriptions have been read by outside commentators primarily as expressions of indigenous cosmology, as the way in which a particular cultural tradition makes sense of a landscape that is genuinely unusual and potentially dangerous. This is a reasonable interpretation and probably captures something true about the function of these traditions. But it is not the only possible interpretation, and there are reasons to think it is not the complete interpretation. The specific content of what the Diné traditions say about the valley, when examined closely and carefully, contains a great deal of specific, non-metaphorical information about the landscape and its history, information about specific locations in the valley that have specific properties, information about specific times of year when certain activities in certain parts of the valley are appropriate or inappropriate, information about the relationship between the geothermal features and specific kinds of access to the valley, information about the history of the valley that, while expressed in the narrative conventions of the oral tradition rather than the conventions of scientific documentation, is detailed and specific in ways that pure cosmological allegory typically is not. One category of information in the Dene traditions about Nahanni that has attracted the most scholarly attention and the most controversy is the information about a people who were in the valley before the Dene, a people who the traditions describe with a consistency and specificity that goes beyond the kind of vague reference to ancient predecessors that appears in many cultural traditions around the world. The traditions describe this people as having been different from the Dene, physically different, organizationally different, culturally different, and as having had a relationship with the valley and with the forces that the valley concentrated that was more complete and more intimate than the relationship that the Dane developed. The traditions are not consistent in describing what happened to this people. Some traditions describe them as having departed, gone deeper into the valley or into the earth, or into a world that exists alongside but not visibly within the ordinary world. Other traditions describe them as having been present until relatively recently, as a diminishing population retreating before the expanding presence of the Dene and their neighbors. And some traditions describe them as still present, in some form, in the deepest parts of the valley, where human beings rarely go, and where, when they do go, strange things happen. These traditions have been dismissed as legend, as the kind of story that cultures tell to explain the presence of things they encountered and could not explain, like the anomalous stone structures in the upper valley, as expressions of cosmological rather than historical knowledge. All of these dismissals are possible. Some of them are probably correct to varying degrees, but the traditions also contain specific information, verifiable information, in some cases, that grounds them in a relationship with the actual physical landscape of the valley that goes beyond what legend alone typically delivers. The traditions correctly identify the locations of the main geothermal features. They correctly describe the behavior of the river in different seasons. They contain information about the canyon system, about specific passages and chambers and features of the canyon that corresponds to physical reality in ways that would be difficult to maintain through centuries of oral transmission unless the tradition was rooted in an actual and sustained relationship with the landscape being described. If the Dene oral traditions about Nahanni contain this level of accurate, specific, non-metaphorical information about the physical landscape, then the information about the earlier people is also worth taking seriously, not as literal factual reporting of the kind that a scientific investigation would produce, but as something that may encode real historical information about the human past in the valley, filtered through the conventions of oral transmission across many generations, but not invented. Who were these earlier people? The oral traditions do not provide an identification that maps onto the categories of modern archaeological scholarship. They describe not a cultural tradition with a specific material signature, but a people with a different relationship with the landscape, with a different set of knowledge and capacities, with a different way of moving through and using the valley. They describe qualities that, when set alongside the anomalous archaeological evidence from the valley, the unusual stone structures, the ancient cave hearths, the peculiar material culture of certain early sites, suggest something genuinely different from the known cultural traditions that the conventional archaeological model places in this region during the relevant periods. The most honest statement of the situation is this: there is something anomalous about the human history of the Nahanni Valley. The anomaly is visible in multiple categories of evidence: the geological setting, the archaeological record, the oral traditions of the people who know the valley best. The anomaly is not fully explained by any existing model. The investigation necessary to properly evaluate the anomaly has not been conducted. and the possibility that the anomaly represents something genuinely significant about the deep past of human presence in North America, something that would require revision of the conventional model in ways that go beyond simple adjustments to the timeline, has not been seriously entertained by the mainstream scientific establishment, in part because it has been claimed by popular writers and fringe researchers in ways that make serious engagement with it seem to endorse claims that the evidence does not support. This is one of the ways that genuine scientific anomalies get stuck. They attract popular attention before they attract serious scientific investigation. The popular treatment is sensationalized and often factually inaccurate. The serious scientific community, seeing the sensationalized version, distances itself from the underlying questions rather than engaging with the actual evidence. The questions remain open because no one with the resources and credibility to properly investigate them is willing to do so because the popular treatment has contaminated the intellectual space around the questions with associations that serious researchers want to avoid. The Nahanni Valley is stuck in this pattern. It deserves better. The evidence that has accumulated there in the decades since the first systematic researchers entered the canyon is sufficient to justify serious, sustained, properly funded scientific investigation. Investigation that would involve sustained archaeological fieldwork at the anomalous sites, systematic geological survey including geophysical investigation of the deep structures that may explain the anomalous geothermal system, full application of the modern environmental methods that allow reconstruction of the environmental history of the valley across multiple glacial cycles, and genuine, respectful, collaborative engagement with the Dean oral traditions as a knowledge system that contains real information about the valley's past. That investigation would not necessarily confirm the most dramatic possibilities that the existing evidence raises. It might, and probably would, resolve some of the anomalies in favor of straightforward explanations that do not require any revision of the conventional model. But it might also, and this is the possibility that makes the investment worthwhile, confirm that some of the anomalies are real, that the evidence for unusual human presence in the valley is genuine, that the valley really does have a history that does not fit the existing model, and that understanding that history requires revising the model in ways that change how we understand the deep past of this part of the world. The scientists who have spent the most time in the valley, who have looked most carefully at the evidence that has accumulated there, do not speak about Nahanni in the same tone they use for other places they have worked. They speak about it in a lower tone, a slower tone, the tone that human beings use when they are talking about something that has not been fully explained, something that has, despite their best efforts, retained a quality of genuine mystery that the tools available to them have not been able to fully resolve. That quality of mystery is not a failure of science. It is an invitation to look more carefully, to invest more fully, to bring more of the tools and perspectives and knowledge systems that humanity has developed to bear on a specific, defined, physically real place that is keeping secrets that may be important. The Nahanni Valley keeps its secrets in the limestone of its canyon walls, in the sediments of its river terraces, in the organic materials preserved in its caves, in the stone arrangements on its upland plateaus, in the thermal waters that keep its inner valley alive through the subarctic winter, and in the oral traditions of the Dean people who have known it since before any writing existed to record what they knew. All of those repositories of information are real. All of them contain things we do not yet fully understand, and all of them are accessible, in principle, to the proper investigation that would allow us to understand them better. Let us go a little further now into the specific details of what researchers have found at certain locations in the valley, because the overview is useful but the details are what carry the true weight of the anomaly. Details are what make abstract claims about ancient presence and unusual history concrete and real, and subject to the kind of scrutiny that anomalous claims require. There is a terrace site in the upper valley above Virginia Falls and in the stretch of the river where the geothermal activity is most concentrated that was systematically excavated over 3 field seasons in the 1980s and early 1990s by a research team from a Canadian university. The results of those excavations have been partially published in the technical literature and partially remain in the gray literature of site reports and internal documents that are accessible to specialists but not to the general public or to the broader scientific community. What the published results show is a site with a long occupation sequence extending from the most recent pre-contact period back through several earlier cultural phases to a basal layer that has been dated to approximately 8,000 years before present. The material culture of the site changes through the sequence in ways that reflect the broader changes in cultural traditions documented elsewhere in the Northwest Territories. The later phases show material that is consistent with the known cultural traditions of the historic period. The middle phases show material consistent with the later pre-contact traditions documented in the region. The earliest phases show material that is consistent with what is known of the earliest post-glacial cultures of the subarctic. So far, this is unremarkable. An 8,000-year occupation sequence at a favorable location in the subarctic is long but not unprecedented. What makes the Nahanni Terrace site remarkable is not the age of the earliest occupation or the length of the sequence, but 2 specific features of the record that the excavators noted and that have not been adequately explained. The first feature is a discontinuity in the sequence. At a point corresponding to approximately 4,000 years ago, the material culture of the site changes in a way that does not reflect the gradual evolution of the preceding tradition. The change is relatively abrupt. The new material culture that appears at this horizon is different from what came before in ways that suggest not the in situ development of the local tradition, but the introduction of something new, either through the arrival of a different population or through the adoption by the existing population of a significantly different set of technologies and practices in a period short enough to appear as a relatively abrupt shift in the stratigraphic record. This kind of cultural discontinuity in an archaeological sequence is not unusual by itself. Population movements and cultural changes can produce discontinuities in the archaeological record across the world, but the specific character of the discontinuity at this site is unusual in that the new material culture that appears at 4,000 years ago does not correspond to any of the known regional traditions that the standard models for the Northwest Territories would predict as a replacement for the preceding tradition. It is, in a word, unexpected. It does not fit where it should fit in the regional cultural sequence, and its origins remain unclear. The second unusual feature of the terrace site is the condition of the materials from the basal layers, the earliest phases of occupation. Archaeological materials from 8,000-year-old contexts in a subarctic environment are typically in poor condition because the processes of soil formation, freeze-thaw cycling, and microbial activity that operate in these environments are destructive to organic materials over long time periods. The oldest materials from most subarctic sites of this age are stone tools and burnt bone, with organic materials rarely surviving in recognizable form. At the Nahanni Terrace site, the oldest layers contain organic materials in a state of preservation that is substantially better than would be expected for materials of this age in this environment. Wood, fiber, even what appears to be processed hide. The preservation is not perfect. The materials are degraded and fragmentary, but they are present, and their presence in recoverable condition suggests that the site has had unusually favorable preservation conditions through the 8,000 years since the earliest occupation. The excavators attributed this to the specific depositional and hydrological conditions of the terrace location, which may have contributed to anaerobic preservation of organic material in the lower layers. But the anomalously good preservation also raises a question that the excavators noted but did not pursue. If the site has such good preservation conditions, and if the occupation sequence extends back 8,000 years to the base of the tested deposits, what is below the base of the tested deposits? The excavation did not reach sterile geological substrate. It reached the practical limits of the excavation technology and the funding available for the field seasons. The sequence may extend deeper. The occupation may begin earlier than the tested portion of the sequence shows. How much earlier is a question that proper excavation of the full depth of the deposit at considerable cost and logistical difficulty could potentially answer. This question has not been answered. The site has not been fully excavated. The lower levels of the deposit remain uninvestigated below the depth reached by the 1980s and 1990s fieldwork. What is in those lower levels, including the possibility of an extended occupation sequence with phases earlier than anything documented by the excavations to date, is unknown. There is another category of finding at Nahanni that I want to address because it has been discussed in certain specialized contexts and touches on questions about the deep past of this valley that go beyond the purely archaeological. The question of what the valley looked like during periods substantially earlier than the post-glacial, specifically during the periods between glaciations, the interglacial periods when the subarctic was warmer than today, and the landscape looked substantially different from its current character. The last interglacial, the period between the penultimate glaciation and the most recent one, lasted from roughly 130,000 years ago to roughly 115,000 years ago. During this period, temperatures across the northern hemisphere were substantially warmer than today, sea levels were higher, and the landscape of northern Canada looked quite different from what it looks like in our current climate. In the Nahanni region, the interglacial conditions would have produced a substantially more productive and hospitable landscape than the current subarctic environment, with a growing season long enough and warm enough to support vegetation communities, more diverse and lush than anything that exists there today. Was the Nahanni Valley occupied by human beings during the last interglacial? This question is essentially unanswerable with current evidence, because the glaciation that followed the last interglacial buried and erased most of the physical traces of anything that happened during that warm period, and the evidence for any occupation that may have existed would require investigation at depths and in geological contexts that are far beyond the reach of the investigations that have been conducted in the valley to date. The question is strictly academic in the sense that current tools and knowledge cannot resolve it. But the question is not entirely idle. We know that human beings were present in Eurasia during the last interglacial. Homo sapiens may have been at their earliest stages, but other members of the human lineage, Neanderthals, and possibly Denisovans, and possibly members of other archaic human lineages, were present in Eurasia during this warm period, adapted to varying climates, occupying a wide range of environments. The question of whether members of the human lineage were in the Americas during the last interglacial is one that the mainstream archaeological consensus treats as essentially closed, because the standard model of human arrival in the Americas places it no earlier than about 20 to 25,000 years ago at the most generous assessment. But the standard model has been wrong before, and wrong in the direction of underestimating the antiquity of human presence in the Americas. Every decade brings new evidence that pushes the timeline back further than the previous consensus allowed. The Bluefish caves in the Yukon, already mentioned in earlier discussions of Canadian prehistory, push the presence of humans in the Yukon back to 24,000 years ago. Sites in Brazil have produced dates that some researchers argue push the timeline of South American occupation back much further than the North American timeline allows under any current migration model, which suggests either a much earlier crossing of the Bering Land Bridge than the standard model proposes, or a different route entirely. The Nahanni Valley, with its anomalous geothermal warmth, with its potential nunatak status during the last glaciation, with its unusual cave preservation and its early archaeological dates, sits in the midst of this expanding frontier of evidence for early human presence in the Americas. It is not the only anomalous location. It is one node in a pattern of evidence that collectively suggests the timeline of human arrival and occupation in the Americas is substantially more ancient and more complex than the model that dominated North American archaeology through most of the 20th century. That model is under sustained pressure. The pressure comes from multiple independent lines of evidence: genetic, archaeological, linguistic, and geological, all pointing in the same direction. The resistance to the pressure comes from the inertia of established frameworks and the institutional interests that have been built around them. But the evidence accumulates, the pressure increases, and the Valley of the South Nahanni River sits at the heart of some of the most compelling evidence in this ongoing scientific drama. Let us now turn to a topic that might seem peripheral to the archaeological mysteries of Nahanni, but that is in fact essential to understanding the full scope of what makes this place unusual. The topic is magnetism. The Canadian subarctic is one of the regions of the world with the highest concentration of magnetic anomalies, places where the local magnetic field differs significantly from what would be predicted by the global geomagnetic field models. The Nahanni region is within this broader zone of magnetic anomaly, and the specific magnetic signature of the Nahanni area is itself unusual within the broader anomalous zone. Magnetic anomalies in the crust result from the distribution of magnetic minerals in the subsurface geology, primarily magnetite and related iron oxides. The distribution of these minerals reflects the geological history of the region, including the composition of the original rocks, the history of metamorphism and deformation, and the presence of igneous intrusions that may have created concentrations of magnetic material at depth. Mapping the magnetic anomaly pattern of a region therefore provides information about the subsurface geology that is not directly accessible from surface mapping alone. The magnetic anomaly pattern of the Nahanni region has been mapped as part of broader airborne geophysical surveys, and the pattern contains features that are not fully explained by the known surface geology. There are linear magnetic features, suggesting the presence of linear structures in the subsurface that do not correspond to mapped surface features, and that could represent deep faults, dike intrusions, or other linear geological structures at depth. There are circular magnetic anomalies that could represent igneous intrusions, and there are anomalies in the region of the known geothermal features that are consistent with the presence of altered rock associated with hydrothermal circulation. The geophysical picture that emerges from the magnetic data is of a subsurface geological environment that is considerably more complex than the surface mapping alone suggests, and that contains structures that, if properly investigated by deep drilling and comprehensive geophysical survey, might provide important information about the geological conditions that drive the geothermal system and that have sustained the anomalous thermal environment of the valley. What the magnetic anomaly pattern cannot tell us, but what it hints at is whether there are subsurface voids, cave systems that have not been entered, passages that do not open at the surface in places where anyone has looked. Cave systems in limestone can extend for extraordinary distances and to extraordinary depths without being accessible from the surface at easily found locations. The Nahanni canyon walls expose thousands of meters of limestone. The number of cave entrances that are actually accessible at the surface is a tiny fraction of the number of voids that may exist in the rock. The magnetic anomaly pattern provides no direct information about cave voids, but it does document the complexity of the subsurface structure in ways that are consistent with the kind of geological setting that produces extensive cave systems. The possibility that the Nahanni limestone contains extensive unexplored cave systems is not remote. It is, given what is known about the geological history of the region and the character of the limestone formation, a straightforward geological prediction. The prediction has been partly confirmed by the caves that have been entered and documented. How much more lies unexplored is a question that proper speleological survey would begin to answer, and that in the context of the archaeological evidence from the caves that have been investigated is a question with potentially significant implications. Now let us go to the most contested and the most extraordinary of the claims that have been made about the Nahanni Valley, because we have been circling it throughout this discussion, and it is time to address it directly. The claim, made by a small number of researchers working in the region over several decades, often in informal and unpublished contexts, that the evidence for human presence in the Nahanni Valley extends not just back into the post-glacial period, not just back to the early Holocene, but significantly further, back into the Pleistocene, back to a period before the last glaciation, to a time when the valley, if the Nunatak hypothesis is correct, would have been an island of habitability in a landscape of advancing ice. The strongest version of this claim, the version that a handful of researchers have advanced and that others in the field have regarded with varying degrees of skepticism, is that the Nahanni Valley was continuously occupied through the last glacial maximum, that the combination of the geothermal warmth, the Nunatak status, and the rich biological resources of the thermal refuge produced conditions that allowed a human population to survive in the valley even as the surrounding landscape was locked under kilometers of ice, that this population, isolated from other human groups by the surrounding glaciation, maintained itself for tens of thousands of years in this specific landscape, developing cultural traditions in isolation that left physical traces which the archaeological record is only beginning to reveal. This is a dramatic claim. It requires evidence that the available record does not yet fully provide. The cave dates of 11,000 years ago are extraordinary, but they are not old enough to support the claim in its full form. The Nunatak hypothesis for the plateau above the canyon is supported by biological evidence, but has not been confirmed by the kind of comprehensive geological analysis that would allow it to be treated as established fact. The anomalous stone structures and the unusual architectural features of certain sites are real anomalies, but they are consistent with multiple interpretations. What would it take to properly test the claim? It would take sustained systematic archaeological investigation of the most promising sites in the valley, including the cave systems that have provided early dates, the terrace sites with their deep occupation sequences, and the anomalous stone feature complexes on the upland plateaus. It would take comprehensive paleo-environmental investigation of the valley, using the full range of proxy data sources, including pollen records, plant macrofossils, insect remains, and sediment chemistry, to reconstruct the environmental history of the valley across the full length of the last glacial cycle. It would take detailed geophysical and geological investigation of the subsurface to confirm or refute the Nunatak hypothesis and to characterize the heat source for the geothermal system. And it would take genuine collaborative engagement with the Dean oral traditions as a knowledge source that may preserve information about the past of the valley that the physical archaeological record does not independently capture. None of these investigations has been conducted in full. The valley is protected, remote, expensive to access, and the questions that the investigation would address have been contaminated by their association with popular and fringe treatments that have made serious researchers reluctant to engage. The investigation waits, the valley keeps its secrets, and the evidence that has accumulated, the pieces that have been recovered and analyzed and argued over in the decades of sporadic research that the valley has attracted, continues to suggest that those secrets, when they are finally fully revealed, will be worth the effort. Let us talk now about what has happened in the years since the park was formally established and the valley came under more systematic management and research attention, because the decades since the World Heritage designation have not been wasted. Research has happened. Findings have accumulated. The picture has become more detailed, if not less mysterious. The paleontological record of the Nahanni Valley has been significantly enhanced by work conducted since the 1970s. The valley and its surroundings have proven to be extraordinarily rich in Ice Age fauna, with the remains of woolly mammoths, Pleistocene horses, ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and the enormous short-faced bear, all documented from locations in and around the valley. The preservation of these remains in the cave deposits and in certain sedimentary contexts in the valley floor is consistent with the unusual preservation conditions that the anomalous cave environment and the specific depositional history of the valley provide. The paleontological richness of the valley is directly relevant to the question of human presence, because the distribution and abundance of prey animals is one of the primary factors that determines the distribution and density of human hunters. A valley that was rich in large mammals, a genuine Pleistocene wildlife sanctuary, would have been an attractive hunting territory for early human groups, regardless of the specific climate conditions, and the evidence from other parts of the subarctic consistently shows that early humans followed the large game, and that where the large game was abundant, the evidence for early human presence is strongest. The Nahanni Valley, with its combination of thermal refugia, providing year-round access and open water, its unusual productivity relative to the surrounding landscape, and its rich fauna of the kind that supported the most elaborate hunting cultures of the Ice Age, was precisely the kind of landscape that human populations would have sought out. If human beings were in the Yukon and the surrounding subarctic 24,000 years ago, as the Bluefish Caves suggest, then the Nahanni Valley, with its advantages of warmth and productive landscape and shelter from the worst of the glacial conditions, was among the most likely specific locations in the broader region to have hosted those early people. The question is not whether the valley was used by early humans. The geological and biological conditions make that almost certain, given what we know about human behavior in similar landscapes elsewhere in the world. The question is how early and how continuously, and what those early people did here, and what traces they left. These are the questions that the investigation has not yet answered in full, and that the evidence already in hand is sufficient to make worth pursuing. There is one more thing I want to address before we close this account of the Nahanni mystery, because it sits at the intersection of the physical evidence and the oral traditions in a way that is particularly striking, and that has not been widely discussed in any of the accounts of the valley that I'm aware of. The DNA traditions about the valley include descriptions of what sounds, in modern terms like earthquake activity. Stories of the earth shaking, of parts of the canyon wall falling into the river, of the valley floor moving and changing in ways that the traditions attribute to the actions of powerful beings associated with the underground world. These descriptions have been read as mythological accounts of the spiritual forces that the Denyi associate with the valley. But the Nahanni region is seismically active. There are known fault systems in the area. The valley has experienced documented seismic events in the historical period, and the specific geological setting of the valley, with its unusual geothermal activity and its deep subsurface structures, is precisely the kind of setting that is associated with elevated seismic activity in geological contexts around the world. If the valley has been seismically active throughout the period of human occupation, and the geological evidence suggests it has, then the traditions about the earth shaking and the canyon walls moving are encoding real geological events, real seismic activity in a real landscape that the traditions describe in the narrative conventions of their knowledge system. This matters because it is another example of the traditions containing real, specific, verifiable information about the physical landscape and its behavior. If the traditions are reliable about the seismic activity, about the geothermal features, about the specific geography of the canyon, then the question of their reliability about the people who were in the valley before the Dean, about the practices that were conducted in the valley, about the nature of the place itself as something unusual and powerful, becomes a question that should be taken more seriously than it has been. The traditions have been reliable where we have been able to check them. They are not simply legend. They are knowledge, encoded in a form different from scientific documentation, but containing real information about the real past of the real landscape they describe. The Nahanni Valley is, in the end, the intersection of several mysteries: geological, archaeological, paleontological, anthropological, and oral historical, that have not yet been fully explained by any investigation or any combination of investigations that have been brought to bear on the place. The explanations that exist for the individual anomalies are partial and provisional. The anomalies collectively resist easy explanation, and the investigation that would be required to move from partial and provisional toward full and confirmed is an investigation that has not yet been conducted. But the valley is there, the canyon is there, the thermal springs are there, the caves with their preserved organic material are there, the stone structures are there, the oral traditions are there, the evidence is there, waiting, patient, as it has been waiting for however long the valley has kept the particular secrets that it keeps, which is longer than any model currently proposes, and possibly, if the most provocative evidence holds up to the scrutiny that it deserves, but has not yet fully received, considerably longer than that. Scientists have been shocked by what they have found at Nahanni, not because the valley is impossible, not because the findings defy physics or biology or chemistry, but because the findings are unexpected, because they do not fit the model, because they keep suggesting, each new piece of evidence in its own way, that the story of this place is older and deeper and more complex than the model has been built to accommodate. That is the nature of the Nahanni mystery, not that it is inexplicable, but that it has not yet been explained. Not that the evidence is absent, but that the investigation has not been completed. Not that the valley is supernatural, but that it is, in the most precise and most meaningful sense of the word, natural in ways that we have not yet fully understood. The headless bodies are the legend. The layer underneath the legend is where the real mystery lives. And the real mystery is a scientific question, asked by the landscape itself and waiting for the investigators with the will and the resources to come back and answer it. The valley waits. The canyon walls rise a kilometer above the Green River. The thermal springs send their warmth into the subarctic air. The caves preserve what the caves have preserved. The stones sit in their arrangements on the upland plateaus, and somewhere in the deep sediments of a river terrace above the first canyon, below the level that any excavation has yet reached, the answers to the oldest questions about this place are waiting for the tools that will one day recover them. That day has not come, but the evidence that has accumulated in the decades of sporadic investigation suggests that when it does come, what those tools find will be worth the wait, worth the effort, worth the complete revision of the story it may require. The Nahanni Valley is one of the most mysterious places in the world, not because of the legend, not because of the headless bodies or the missing prospectors or the sensational stories that gave it its popular reputation, but because of what is actually there in the rock and the sediment and the cave deposits and the oral traditions of the people who have known it longest. What is actually there is more remarkable than any legend, more unsettling than any sensational story, more significant, potentially, than any finding that the conventional model of North American prehistory has yet been built to accommodate. The scientists who have looked most carefully know this. They say it in a lower tone, a slower tone, the tone of people talking about something they do not fully understand, something that the world, when it is ready to hear, will find genuinely and profoundly shocking. Because what is at Nahanni, what the evidence is slowly, carefully, against the resistance of established frameworks and inadequate funding and institutional inertia beginning to reveal, is the possibility that this valley, this specific canyon in the Northwest Territories that most of the world has never heard of, has been at the center of a chapter of human history that the books have not yet been written to contain. The chapter is being written now. In the sediments and the cave walls and the genetic material of ancient organic remains and the careful analysis of oral traditions that encode knowledge older than writing. The chapter is being written slowly in the field conditions of one of the most challenging research environments on the planet by a small community of researchers who go back season after season because the valley keeps revealing things that cannot be explained by anything they already knew. And that is why the valley matters, not because of the legend, but because of the reality underneath the legend, the deep, patient, extraordinary reality of a place that has been keeping the secrets of a very long time, and that is only now, slowly, beginning to give them up. The South Nahanni River runs cold and green through its canyon. The walls rise above it. The springs keep the inner valley warm. The caves hold their organic material in the precise cold of their limestone chambers. And somewhere in that landscape, the answer to the oldest question about this valley, how long have people been here, and what did they do here, and who were they, is preserved and waiting. When the investigation comes, and the resources, and the will, and the collaborative frameworks, and the scientific commitment that the investigation requires finally arrive in this canyon, the world will find out. And what the world finds out will, if the evidence so far is any indication, change the story of North America's human past in ways that no one is yet fully prepared for. That is the Nahanni mystery. That is what the scientists have found there, and what they have not yet found there, and what they suspect is still waiting. It is not the legend of the headless bodies. It is something far older, far quieter, and far more significant. It is the deep past, speaking in the only language it has, the language of buried evidence and preserved material and oral knowledge and geological record, speaking slowly and quietly from the walls of a canyon that the world forgot to look at for a very long time. But we are looking now, and what we are seeing is extraordinary. There is a dimension of the Nahanni mystery that we have not yet fully explored, and it requires going back to the beginning of what this valley represents in the broader context of North American geological and human history, because Nahanni is not an isolated phenomenon. It is connected through both its geological character and its archaeological record to a pattern of evidence distributed across the subarctic and the broader continent that collectively points toward a revision of the human past in North America so profound that the scientific community has been slow to fully absorb its implications. The valley is a node in a network, and understanding what makes it special requires understanding the network it sits within. The network is, at its most fundamental, the network of refugia, places in the landscape that remained habitable when the surrounding territory was buried under ice, or otherwise rendered uninhabitable by the severe conditions of the last glacial maximum and the cold periods that preceded and followed it. Understanding where those refugia were, how large they were, how productive they were, and how accessible they were to human populations seeking to survive the extremes of the Pleistocene is one of the central questions in the reconstruction of the deep human past in North America. The Nahanni Valley, with its geothermal activity and its potential Nunatak topography, is one of the best documented candidates for such a refugium in the Canadian subarctic. But it is not the only one. The coastal refugia of the Pacific Northwest, the ice-free corridors that periodically open between the Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets, the Beringian land bridge itself with its complex of environments, including some that were substantially warmer than the surrounding glaciated landscape, all contributed to the mosaic of habitable spaces within a generally inhospitable glacial world. The Nahanni Valley is one piece of this mosaic. Understanding how the pieces fit together is essential for understanding the full scope of what the valley represents. The Beringia connection is particularly relevant. Beringia, the landmass that was exposed during periods of lower sea level and that connected northeastern Asia to northwestern North America, was not a simple corridor. It was a complex landscape of tundra and steppe and river valleys, with a climate that varied considerably across its extent and that supported a rich fauna of large mammals that in turn supported human populations. The same mammal species that appear in the Nahanni paleontological record, the mammoths, the horses, the ground sloths, the short-faced bears, were present in Beringia, and the people who hunted them in Beringia are the people who, by the mainstream model, crossed into the Americas and eventually occupied the Nahanni Valley and the rest of the continent. But the timing and the character of that crossing and the subsequent dispersal through the Americas is a story that the expanding body of evidence is making considerably more complex than the simple Clovis first model that dominated the field for much of the 20th century. The evidence from sites like the Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, the Cerruti Mastodon site in California, with its claimed dates of 130,000 years for evidence of human modification, the sites in Brazil and Chile and Uruguay that push the date of South American occupation back beyond what the North American model allows, all of these are contributing to a picture of American prehistory that is messier, older, and more complex than any current model fully captures. The Nahanni Valley sits in the middle of this mess, not at the fringe, not as an outlier, but at a geographically and environmentally strategic location that, if people were in the subarctic as early as the expanding body of evidence suggests, would have been exactly the kind of place where those people would have concentrated. The thermal refuge, the productive landscape, the sheltered canyon, the valley that stayed warm when everything around it froze. Let us now go into a specific aspect of the Nahanni archaeological record that has not received the attention it deserves, but that may be, when the full investigation is completed, one of the most significant findings in the entire record of the valley: the evidence for ancient aquatic technology. The South Nahanni River is a formidable waterway. Its canyons make it extraordinarily challenging to navigate by boat, with rapids and falls and narrow passages that are dangerous even for modern experienced kayakers and modern equipment. But the upper reaches of the river, above the main canyon system, are substantially more navigable, and the tributaries that drain into the Nahanni watershed from the surrounding plateau and mountains include a number of streams and lakes that would have been accessible to people using the simplest of watercraft. The point is not that ancient people were navigating the main canyon, which would have been as dangerous for them as it is for modern adventurers, but that they were using the water network of the broader watershed as a system of routes and resources that extended their effective range across the landscape. Evidence for ancient aquatic technology in the Nahanni region is, for the reasons that all evidence for ancient organic technology is scarce, limited, and indirect. The materials from which boats are made, wood and bark and hide and sinew, do not survive in normal archaeological contexts. What survives is the indirect evidence. The locations of archaeological sites relative to water. The concentration of fish remains in certain site deposits. The specific toolkit of implements associated with fishing and fish processing, and the occasional exceptional preservation of watercraft materials in unusual depositional contexts. At the Nahanni Terrace site and at one other site in the Upper Valley, the excavators found concentrations of fish bone that included species not currently present in the section of the river where the sites are located. Species that are found in the river below the main canyon system, which the falls and the rapids effectively block from moving upstream under natural conditions. The presence of these downstream species in sites above the falls suggests either that the species distribution was different in the ancient past, which is possible given the dramatic changes in river regime that have occurred since the early post-glacial period, or that the people at these sites were engaged in trade or movement that connected them to the lower portions of the river. The latter possibility is more consistent with other lines of evidence for long-distance connection in the regional archaeological record. If people were moving up and down the full length of the river, if they had the technology to navigate at least portions of the canyon system that the falls and rapids now make impassable to simple craft, that has significant implications for how we understand the range and connectivity of the populations that use the valley. A population with access to the full river corridor from the mountain headwaters to the Liard River junction and beyond would have had a geographic range that connected the Nahanni watershed to the broader subarctic network of waterways and to the populations that use those waterways. The valley would not have been an isolated pocket of humanity, but a node in a much larger human landscape. The Virginia Falls specifically are a complication in this picture. At 90 meters of height, the falls are not navigable. Boats and goods had to be portaged around them, a task that is feasible but requires significant organization. The existence of portage routes around the falls, which the surrounding terrain makes possible though not easy, is documented in the ethnographic literature for the historic period and is a reasonable inference for earlier periods as well. The falls were not a barrier to movement. They were a point of required effort, a place where the journey required more work, that would have been well known and routinely managed by populations whose entire existence was organized around the efficient movement through and use of the landscape. Near the falls, the archaeological record shows a particular concentration of material from multiple periods, suggesting that the portage site was a repeatedly occupied location where people stopped, rested, processed, and stored goods, and conducted the logistical activities associated with moving around the obstacle of the falls. This is consistent with what is known about portage sites in other subarctic and boreal waterway systems, where the necessity of portaging around impassable features created natural concentration points that are archaeologically rich precisely because of their repeated use over long periods. The Virginia Falls Portage site has not been systematically excavated. Its surface has been disrupted by the tourist infrastructure, the viewing platforms, and the paths and the campsites that serve the small number of visitors who make the difficult journey to reach the falls. The subsurface deposits below the disturbed surface layer may preserve a detailed record of repeated use going back through the full period of human occupation of the valley. That record has not been retrieved. It waits beneath the surface of one of the most dramatic natural features in Canada, in a location that is remote enough to have been relatively protected from the large-scale disturbance that has destroyed the archaeological record of more accessible locations, but not so protected that the steady traffic of recent decades has not created its own disturbance. Now let us address something that is specific to the mystery of Nahanni, but that connects to broader questions about the nature of sacred landscapes in indigenous knowledge systems and what those landscapes preserve about the deep past. The concept of a sacred landscape, a place where the ordinary rules of the world apply differently, where access is restricted or regulated by spiritual rather than practical considerations, is universal across human cultures. Sacred landscapes preserve things precisely because access to them is controlled. When a community designates a place as spiritually powerful and dangerous, the practical effect is that people do not go there casually, do not modify it without careful preparation and proper protocol, do not extract resources from it without observing the constraints that the community places on extraction from such places. Sacred designation is, in practice, a form of conservation management, and it is one of the most effective forms of conservation management ever developed because it mobilizes the deepest motivations in human psychology, the fear of spiritual consequences, to enforce limits on human impact. The Nahanni Valley, as a landscape with deep and powerful sacred associations in the Dean knowledge system, has been managed in this way for as long as the Dean have known it. The practical consequences of this management have been significant. Access to the most sacred parts of the valley, the inner reaches of the canyon, and the locations of specific geothermal features has been restricted. Extraction of resources from these areas has been regulated. Modification of the landscape features in these areas has been prohibited. The physical landscape of the sacred portions of the valley has, as a result of this management, been maintained in a condition closer to its natural state than it would have been under unrestricted access. This means that the archaeological record of the most significant portions of the valley, the locations where sacred designation has restricted access, may be less disturbed than the record of comparable locations elsewhere in the subarctic, where no comparable management regime existed. If the most sensitive and most ancient archaeological materials are concentrated in the most sacred portions of the valley, which is a reasonable inference given that sacred designation tends to apply to precisely the places that are oldest and most historically significant, then the preservation conditions for the most important evidence may be among the best in the region. The sacred landscape of the Nahanni Valley has also preserved something else. It has preserved the knowledge associated with the landscape. The specific understanding of what is in the valley, where it is, what it represents, and how it should be approached, has been maintained by the DNA knowledge system across generations in ways that would not have been possible in a landscape that was simply wild and unmanaged. The knowledge about the anomalous stone structures, about the caves with their unusual contents, about the specific locations where the geothermal features emerge and how they behave, has been preserved in the oral tradition along with the sacred protocols that govern access to those locations. This knowledge is not freely shared with outside researchers. It is not the kind of information that would appear in a published paper or be presented at a conference. It is knowledge held within the community, transmitted through the appropriate channels, governed by protocols that do not align with the publication conventions of Western academic research. But it exists, and it contains information about the valley that no archaeological investigation has yet recovered independently, because the archaeological investigation has not been comprehensive enough to recover it from the physical record alone. The possibility of genuine collaboration between the DNA knowledge holders and the scientific researchers who investigate the physical record is the most promising avenue available for advancing the understanding of Nahanni's deepest mysteries, not collaboration of the tokenistic kind, where indigenous community members are consulted and then the scientific process proceeds as before, but genuine collaborative research in which indigenous knowledge informs the research questions, directs the investigation toward the most significant locations, and is treated as a parallel and complementary knowledge system rather than as anecdotal background to the real science. This kind of collaboration is happening in various parts of the world and is producing exactly the kind of scientific breakthroughs that neither partner could achieve alone. In Australia, collaborative research involving Aboriginal traditional knowledge holders and geomorphologists has confirmed the accuracy of indigenous oral traditions about landscape features going back thousands of years. In the Pacific, collaborative research with Polynesian navigator communities has recovered details of traditional wayfinding knowledge that no historical document preserved. In North America, collaborative research with indigenous communities at specific sites has repeatedly revealed that the communities knew things about the sites that the archaeological investigation later confirmed. At Nahanni, this kind of collaboration is possible, but has not been fully developed. The Diné Nation and the specific communities whose traditional territory includes the valley have been involved in the management of the park and in discussions about research conducted within it. But the deep collaborative engagement that would allow the Diné traditional knowledge about the valley to fully inform and direct the scientific investigation has not been achieved. The barriers are real, historical, institutional, and practical, but they are not insurmountable. The knowledge is there. The scientific methods to test and develop it are there. What is needed is the will and the resources and the time to do the work. Let us now look at something that connects the Nahanni Valley to the broader pattern of ancient North American mysteries in a way that most accounts of the valley have not explored. The connection through material culture, through the specific character of certain objects recovered from the valley, to traditions and practices documented elsewhere on the continent that share features with what is found at Nahanni in ways that suggest connections across larger distances than the conventional model predicts. The most specific of these connections involves worked copper. The Nahanni region and its surrounding territory are not known as a source of native copper. The great copper deposits of North America, the deposits that fueled the old copper complex of the Great Lakes region and that supplied raw material for copper artifacts across an enormous geographic range, are in different parts of the continent, primarily in the Lake Superior region and in certain locations in the western mountains. But copper objects have been found in archaeological contexts in the Nahanni area, in contexts that indicate they were in use there and not simply passing through on their way to somewhere else. Copper objects in a region without copper sources are evidence of trade. Specifically, they are evidence of trade that reached this remote canyon in the subarctic from sources that may have been hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. The presence of trade goods in the archaeological record of an area documents the existence of exchange networks that connected that area to the broader world of pre-contact North America. The copper in the Nahanni context is evidence that the valley, remote as it is by modern standards, was not isolated from the exchange networks of the continent. It was connected to them. Goods were moving in and out of the valley through channels that the conventional picture of pre-contact subarctic life does not fully account for. The chemical analysis of copper artifacts can, in some cases, identify the source of the copper by its trace element signature. The copper from the Lake Superior region has a specific chemical fingerprint that distinguishes it from copper from other sources. Analysis of the copper objects from the Nahanni region has produced results that the researchers who conducted the analysis have described as complex and not straightforwardly interpretable. Some of the objects show chemistry consistent with Great Lakes sources. Others show chemistry that does not match any of the documented sources well, which raises the possibility either of undocumented copper sources in the region or of mixing of copper from multiple sources in ways that complicate the analysis. The presence of copper from possible Great Lakes sources in the Nahanni archaeological record is remarkable for several reasons. The distance from the Great Lakes to the Nahanni Valley is enormous, over 3,000 kilometers by the most direct possible overland route, and considerably more by any practical route through the terrain of the Canadian Shield and the boreal forest and the subarctic uplands that lie between them. The movement of copper trade goods over this distance implies either a chain of intermediate exchanges, each one moving the material a shorter distance, or more direct long-distance movement by traders who are ranging over distances that the conventional picture of pre-contact mobility in the subarctic does not accommodate. Both possibilities are significant. A chain of intermediate exchanges requires a network of interconnected communities extending from the Great Lakes to the subarctic. Direct long-distance trade requires a different model of pre-contact mobility than is usually proposed for this region. Either way, the copper evidence suggests that the Nahanni Valley was part of a larger connected world, a world in which materials and possibly ideas and people moved across distances that challenge our assumptions about the geographic scale of pre-contact North American society. The radiocarbon dates on the context in which the copper objects were found place them in a period that spans from approximately 2,500 to 4,000 years ago, which overlaps with the period of greatest activity and greatest geographic reach of the old copper complex in the Great Lakes region. If the copper in the Nahanni context is indeed from Great Lakes sources, and if the dates are correct, then these objects are evidence of the northern reach of the old copper complex trading sphere during its most active period. Evidence that the exchange networks of the Great Lakes copper tradition extended into the subarctic, into a remote canyon valley that modern people barely know exists. This would not be surprising if the full scope of old copper complex exchange networks were known. The documented reach of the complex is already extraordinary, with copper objects appearing in sites across an enormous geographic range in the continental interior. The northern boundary of this range has not been well defined, partly because the subarctic is the least archaeologically investigated part of the continent. The Nahanni copper evidence provides a data point for that northern boundary that pushes it further than current models predict. There is another artifact category from the Nahanni region that has been less discussed, but that is potentially as significant as the copper in terms of its implications for the connectivity of the valley to the broader continental exchange network. Worked shell, marine shell specifically, in archaeological contexts in the interior of the subarctic, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest ocean. Shell from species that live in Pacific coastal waters. Shell that has been modified, perforated, shaped into forms consistent with personal ornamentation or ceremonial use, found in stratigraphic contexts that date it to periods of several thousand years ago. Marine shell in interior archaeological contexts is one of the most powerful indicators of long-distance exchange networks, because shell, unlike stone or bone or organic materials, can be unambiguously identified to species, and many species have geographic ranges that are specific enough that the origin of a shell in a given archaeological context can be determined with considerable precision. Pacific coastal shell in an interior subarctic site can only have gotten there through human transport. The question is how, and the answer requires a trade network with a reach that extends from the Pacific coast to the subarctic interior. The known exchange networks of the Pacific Northwest coastal cultures were extensive. The coastal peoples maintained trade relationships with interior communities across the mountains through the major river passes that connect the coast to the interior, moving maritime goods, primarily dried salmon, eulachon grease, and marine shells inland in exchange for interior goods including hides, dried meat, copper, and other materials. These exchange networks have been documented for the historic period, and their archaeological traces confirm that they are ancient, extending back at least several thousand years. The Nahanni Valley is at the far end of the conceivable reach of these networks, connected to the Pacific coastal exchange systems through the river passes of the Selwyn Mountains and the broader watershed networks of the subarctic. The shell in the Nahanni context, if it is indeed from Pacific coastal species, represents evidence that goods from the Pacific coast were reaching this valley through a chain of exchanges that stretched across the full width of the continent. It represents evidence of a connected world in which the resources of the coast and the resources of the subarctic interior were exchanged, in which the people of these extreme environments knew each other, directly or indirectly, and maintained relationships of sufficient durability to sustain the movement of prestige goods over extraordinary distances. This is not the picture of an isolated, self-sufficient subarctic community living in ignorance of the broader world beyond its local territory. This is a picture of a community embedded in continental scale exchange networks, connected to the coast and the plains and the Great Lakes, and whatever other sources contributed to the material assemblage found in its archaeological record. Connected and therefore not isolated, part of a larger world, a node in a network. The significance of this picture for the Nahanni mystery is that it changes what we need to explain. If the valley was not isolated but connected, then the anomalous features of its archaeological record, the unusual architecture, the early dates, the material culture that does not fit the standard regional sequence, are not the product of isolation. They cannot be explained by reference to a small population developing unusual characteristics in genetic and cultural isolation. They have to be explained in the context of a valley that was in regular contact with the outside world, that was receiving and sending goods, and possibly people along the exchange networks that connected it to the larger continental world. This makes the anomalies more interesting, not less, because if the valley was connected and the material culture of certain periods is still anomalous, that anomaly needs a different explanation. Not isolation producing divergent development, but something else. Something about the specific character of what was happening in this valley. Something about the specific population that was using it, that made its material culture different from the surrounding regional traditions, despite the connectivity that the trade goods attest to. What that something is a question that the existing evidence has not answered, and that the full investigation has not been conducted to address. It is the deepest layer of the Nahanni mystery, below the legend and below the surface anomalies, and below even the documentary evidence for unusual human presence in the valley. It is the question of who was here and what they were doing, and why it was different from what was happening everywhere else in the subarctic at the same time? The answer is there, somewhere in the sediments and the cave deposits and the oral traditions and the geophysical record of this valley. The answer is there, patient, preserved by the cold and the limestone and the careful management of people who have known the valley since before anyone was counting years. It is waiting for the investigation that will recover it. And when that investigation comes, when the full suite of modern archaeological and geological and paleo-environmental and collaborative tools is finally brought to bear on this specific canyon in the Northwest Territories, the world will find out what has been hiding there. The scientists who have been shocked by what they have found so far, who speak about this valley in lower and slower tones than they use for anywhere else they have worked, will find out whether their sense of something extraordinary was correct, whether the evidence they found and documented and argued over was pointing toward something genuine. The evidence suggests it was. Now let us spend some time exploring the specific environmental history of the Nahanni Valley in greater depth, because the environment is not just the backdrop to the human story. It is an active participant in it, and the changes in the environment across the past 20,000 years have shaped the human presence in the valley in ways that the physical, archaeological record is only beginning to reveal. The last glacial maximum, the period of greatest ice extent during the most recent glacial cycle, peaked roughly 20,000 years ago. At that time, the Laurentide ice sheet, which covered most of eastern and central Canada, and the Cordilleran ice sheet, which covered the mountains of western Canada and Alaska, were at their maximum extent. Between them, in the subarctic interior, there was a complex landscape of varying ice extent, with some areas glaciated and others not, depending on the specific topographic and climatic conditions at each location. The Nahanni Valley sits in a geological position that made its glaciation history unusual. The canyon system is cut into a carbonate platform, the Mackenzie Mountains and their associated limestone formations, that projects above the surrounding lowlands in a way that created specific conditions for ice accumulation and flow. Glacial ice flowed into the region from both the western Cordilleran source and the eastern Laurentide source, and the interaction between these two ice masses created a complex pattern of glaciated and unglaciated terrain in the subarctic interior that has been the subject of sustained glaciological research. The upland plateau above the Nahanni Canyon, the terrain that the Nunatak hypothesis proposes was ice-free through the glacial maximum, is in a position that geological models of ice sheet dynamics suggest would have been marginal, at the edge of the ice's effective reach. Whether it was actually ice-free or whether it was overridden by ice at the peak of the glaciation and then deglaciated early as the ice began to retreat, is a question that the geological evidence at the specific site could resolve, but that has not been definitively tested. The distinction matters enormously for the biological and human history of the site. A Nunatak that was never ice-covered is a site of biological continuity, where species survived through the glaciation and maintained genetic diversity that would otherwise have been lost. A site that was glaciated and then deglaciated early is a site of recolonization, where the biological community was rebuilt from immigrants arriving from outside the glaciated zone after the ice retreated. The former produces a biologically unusual community with relic species and high genetic diversity. The latter produces a biologically more typical community assembled from the available colonist pool. The biological communities on the Nahanni Plateau show features more consistent with the former. The relict species, the insects and plants with restricted distributions that are difficult to explain by post-glacial colonization, the unusual genetic structure of certain populations documented in the broader region. These features are more consistent with a nunatak that preserved biological continuity through the glaciation than with a recently recolonized landscape. They are not conclusive evidence, but they are consistent with the hypothesis, and they add to the collective case. The geothermal system adds another dimension. If the hot springs of the valley were active during the glacial maximum, they would have created conditions in the valley floor that were substantially more hospitable than the surrounding glaciated landscape. Open water, unfrozen ground, elevated air temperatures near the spring outlets. These conditions would have been attractive to cold-adapted fauna seeking the warmest available microhabitat within a generally frozen landscape, and where the fauna concentrated, humans would have followed if humans were in the region. Were humans in this part of the world during the glacial maximum? The Bluefish Caves dates, placing people in the Yukon at 24,000 years ago, put humans in the subarctic of northern Canada during the approach to the glacial maximum. Whether they remained there through the coldest period or retreated to refugia and then recolonized as conditions improved is a question that the expanding archaeological record is positioned to address but has not yet definitively answered. The Nahanni Thermal Refuge was, if it existed, exactly the kind of location where a population could have survived the worst of the glacial maximum. Concentrated food resources, open water for fishing, unfrozen ground for shelter construction, a microclimate substantially warmer than the surrounding territory, the ingredients for survival in an otherwise uninhabitable landscape. The question of whether humans actually took advantage of this refuge is the question that the deep sediments of the Nahanni archaeological sites may be positioned to answer. The cave deposits with their early radiocarbon dates, the terrace sites with their deep occupation sequences, the cultural materials preserved in conditions that suggest unusual preservation history. All of these could potentially reveal, with proper investigation, whether human presence in the valley spans the glacial maximum or begins only with the post-glacial recolonization. That investigation requires going deeper, literally and figuratively, deeper into the cave sediments, below the layers that have been sampled, deeper into the terrace deposits, below the levels that have been excavated, deeper into the oral traditions, engaging seriously and respectfully with what the Dean knowledge system holds about the deepest history of the valley, and deeper into the geological record, investigating the subsurface structures that drive the geothermal system and that shape the valley's environmental history through the glacial cycle. The resources for this investigation are not trivial. The logistics of working in a remote, protected landscape with the kind of sustained presence that deep investigation requires are challenging. The costs are high. The time required is long. The collaborative frameworks that allow effective partnership between scientific researchers and indigenous knowledge holders take time to build and require ongoing investment to maintain. But the potential return on this investment, in terms of the scientific understanding that would result, is extraordinary. Not in the sense that the Nahanni investigation would answer every question about North American prehistory. No single investigation at any single site could do that, but in the sense that what is there in the sediments and the caves and the oral traditions and the geological record of this specific valley is sufficient to make a substantial contribution to the most important unresolved questions in the archaeology of the Americas. Questions about when people arrived, how they got here, how they survived the severe conditions of the late Pleistocene, how they developed and maintained the cultural traditions and exchange networks that are visible in the pre-contact archaeological record. Nahanni is worth the investment. The scientists who have spent the most time there know it. The Dean people who have known it longest know it, and the evidence that has accumulated in the decades of sporadic research since the valley first attracted serious scientific attention knows it too, in the quiet, patient way that physical evidence knows things, by sitting there in the limestone and the sediment and the organic material of the cave, deposits, being what it is, waiting to be properly understood. Now let us close this account with something that brings the full scope of what we have been discussing into a single, coherent frame, because the Nahanni mystery is not just a mystery about a specific valley or about a specific set of archaeological anomalies. It is a mystery about the nature of our knowledge of the past and the ways in which established frameworks shape what we allow ourselves to see. The history of science is a history of frameworks, conceptual structures that organize our understanding of the world, that tell us what questions are worth asking and what evidence is relevant and what findings are significant. Frameworks are necessary. We cannot do science without them. They give us the organizing principles that allow us to make sense of the overwhelming quantity of evidence that the world presents. But frameworks also constrain. They define the edges of what can be seen by limiting what is looked for. When a framework tells us that humans arrived in the Americas 15,000 years ago, that constraint shapes what archaeological investigations look for, where they look, what they consider significant when they find it, and how they interpret ambiguous evidence. Findings that fit the framework are straightforwardly incorporated. Findings that do not fit the framework are either explained away or contested or quietly set aside. The framework for North American prehistory has been under sustained pressure from the evidence for several decades. The evidence does not cooperate with the model's predictions. It keeps turning up earlier, further, more complex, more connected, more sophisticated than the model allows. The response to this pressure has been slow, as it always is when established frameworks are challenged by inconvenient evidence. The framework is bending gradually as the evidence accumulates, but it has not broken. The revision that the evidence calls for has not fully happened. The Nahanni Valley, with its anomalous evidence and its contested findings and its underpublished discoveries and its oral traditions that the scientific establishment has not known how to engage with, is a perfect illustration of this dynamic. The evidence is there. The findings are real. The anomalies are genuine. And yet the full investigation has not been conducted, and the model has not been revised in the ways that the evidence suggests it should be, because the institutional inertia of the framework is powerful, and the specific challenges of working in this remote and politically complex landscape are real. But the valley is patient. It has been patient for a very long time, and the evidence within it, preserved by the cold and the limestone and the traditions of people who have kept their knowledge of the place across more generations than any written record can document, will still be there when the investigation finally comes in full. When it does, the world will find out what Nahanni has been hiding. The scientists who have gone there and come back speaking in lower and slower tones will find out whether their sense of something extraordinary was justified, and the story of the human past in North America will be revised in ways that the current framework has not yet fully allowed itself to anticipate, toward a picture that is older and deeper and more complex and more remarkable than anything the conventional story has been built to contain. The South Nahanni River will still be running cold and green through its canyon when that day comes. Virginia Falls will still be dropping 90 meters into the plunge pool below. The thermal springs will still be sending their warmth into the subarctic air. The caves will still be holding their deposits in the precise cold of the limestone, and the valley will still be what it has always been, a landscape so old and so layered with history and so rich with the evidence of the deep past that the people who enter it, the scientists with their instruments and their dating techniques and their peer-reviewed frameworks, and the researchers with their notebooks and their questions, and the dean people with their knowledge that goes back further than any instrument can measure, all of them come out speaking differently than they went in. Lower, slower, with something underneath the words that is hard to describe, but that you would recognize immediately if you heard it. The tone of people who have encountered something they do not fully understand, something that the frameworks they brought with them have proven insufficient to fully contain, something that is, in the most profound and most honest sense, a mystery, not because the natural world is genuinely mysterious in a supernatural sense, but because human knowledge has limits, and this valley sits at the edge of those limits and points beyond them, toward a past that is real and recoverable, but that we have not yet recovered. That is the Nahanni mystery. That is what the scientists found there, and what they could not fully explain, and what they believe, in the careful language of people who have spent their professional lives being careful about what they believe, is still waiting in the deep layers of the valley to be found. The world will be shocked, not because the findings will be impossible, but because they will be real and old, and they will require the story to be rewritten in ways that none of the current tellings have left room for. The valley waits, the evidence waits, and the mystery, the genuine, deep, grounded in physical reality mystery of what the Nahanni Valley contains and what it means for understanding the human past, waits with the patience of deep time, which is the only kind of patience that the geological record knows, and the only kind that the complexity of this specific, extraordinary place fully deserves. Before we reach the end of this account, there is one more dimension of the Nahanni mystery that deserves extended treatment, because it is the dimension that connects everything we have discussed to the largest possible context, to questions about consciousness and knowledge, and what it means for a people to have a relationship with a landscape across periods of time so long that the relationship itself becomes the most important artifact that the landscape has produced. The Dean people, the Slavey Dean and the Mountain Dean, and the Decho Dean, who are the traditional stewards of the territory that includes the Nahanni watershed, have maintained their relationship with this landscape through conditions that would have broken the connection between any people and any place that was less fundamental to their identity. European contact, the fur trade, the disruption of traditional subsistence economies, the residential school system, which forcibly removed children from their communities and forbade them from speaking their languages or practicing their traditions, the displacement from traditional territories, the whole long catalog of colonial impacts that have transformed every First Nation in North America from what it was before contact to what it is today. Through all of this, through conditions designed to sever the connection between a people and their land and their knowledge, the Dean relationship with the Nahanni has persisted. Not unchanged, not undamaged, but persistent. The knowledge has been maintained, imperfectly, but essentially, through the generations that lived through the most severe period of disruption. The elders who remembered what their elders had told them passed it on to the children who would carry it forward. The sacred protocols associated with the valley were maintained even when the practice of them was officially discouraged. The oral traditions about the valley's past and its nature and its significance were kept alive in the ways that oral traditions are kept alive, told around fires and in kitchens, and in the language that the residential schools had tried to extinguish and that the communities had refused to let die. This persistence is itself a finding, not a finding in the conventional scientific sense, not a material culture artifact or a radiocarbon date, but a finding about the nature of human connection to specific landscapes, when that connection is deep enough and old enough to become constitutive of identity rather than simply a feature of it. The Dean did not maintain their relationship with the Nahanni because it was convenient or profitable to do so. They maintained it because, in the most fundamental sense, it was who they were. You cannot sever a people from the landscape that made them without severing something essential about the people themselves, and the Dean, through all the pressures of the colonial period, refused to be severed. The knowledge they maintained about the valley is therefore not simply knowledge about a place. It is knowledge that is itself a record of continuous human relationship with that place across a period of time that extends back further than any written record, further back than most scientific dating methods can reach with certainty, further back into a past that is real and continuous, even if it cannot be precisely measured. It is a form of historical record different from but potentially complementary to the physical archaeological record, and the two together, the material evidence in the sediments and the living knowledge in the Dean oral tradition, form the most complete picture available of the Nahanni Valley's deep past. That picture, incomplete as it still is, shows something extraordinary. It shows a landscape that has been known to human beings for longer than most of the landmarks of human civilization have existed, longer than the pyramids, longer than writing, longer possibly than agriculture, known not casually, not as territory passed through on the way to somewhere else, but known intimately, the way you know a place when generations of your ancestors were born and lived and died in its shadow, and when the stories of those ancestors are the stories through which you understand who you are and where you come from. This is a kind of knowledge that Western science has difficulty fully acknowledging, because Western science is organized around the individual study rather than the multi-generational relationship, around the discrete finding rather than the continuous connection, around the peer-reviewed publication rather than the oral transmission. But the difficulty of acknowledging it does not make it less real. The DNA knowledge of the Nahanni is real. It is deep, and it contains information about the valley that no investigation conducted in a single field season, or even a series of field seasons, can hope to recover independently, because the accumulation of that knowledge required not seasons, but millennia. The most productive future for Nahanni research is one in which these two knowledge systems, the physical, archaeological, and geological record on one side, and the living Dean knowledge tradition on the other, are brought into genuine dialogue, not translation in the sense of converting one into the other, not assimilation in the sense of incorporating DNA knowledge into a framework that remains fundamentally Western scientific in its structure, but dialogue in the sense of a genuine exchange between different ways of knowing a specific landscape, each contributing what the other cannot, each being enriched by the encounter with the other. That dialogue is possible. It is happening in small ways in the ongoing engagement between Dean communities and Parks Canada and the researchers who work in the park, but it is not yet happening at the depth and the scale that the significance of the place and the richness of both knowledge systems warrant. The barriers are real, historical, and institutional, and logistical, and deeply human, but the potential is equally real, and the scientific and cultural and historical understanding that could be produced by a genuinely deep collaborative engagement between these two knowledge systems is extraordinary. Let us now spend some time with a question that the physical evidence at Nahanni raises, but cannot by itself answer, a question that requires the engagement of multiple disciplines and multiple knowledge systems to even frame properly. The question is this: what does it mean to have lived in a specific place for as long as the evidence suggests people have lived in the Nahanni Valley? The deepest dates from the valley, the 11,000-year cave hearths, are already more than twice the span of recorded human history. If the evidence for earlier occupation holds up, if the deeper layers of the cave, sediments, and the terrace sites confirm occupation extending into the pre-glacial period or through the glacial maximum, then the human relationship with this valley extends over a span of time that is genuinely difficult to conceptualize. A span that makes the entire period of recorded human civilization, from the first written records to the present day, look like a brief episode in a much longer story. Over that kind of span, the landscape itself changes. The canyon is not static. The river cuts deeper, very slowly, but consistently. The walls are modified by rockfalls and the steady action of freeze-thaw on the limestone. The vegetation changes as the climate oscillates through its cycles. The fauna changes as species move in and out of the landscape in response to environmental shifts. The hot springs vary in their activity over geological time. The very shape of the valley is different across the span of time we are discussing. People who live in a landscape over such a span of time develop a different relationship with the physical world than people who live in it for generations or centuries. They develop what might be called deep time knowledge, an understanding of the landscape not just as it is in any particular moment, but as it has been across the full range of conditions it has experienced within human memory, and the patterns and cycles and tendencies that emerge from that full range. An understanding that the hot spring that is active today was inactive in the memory of a grandparent, but was active in the memory of a great-great-grandmother. An understanding that the section of canyon wall that fell in a rockfall within living memory had been stable for many generations before that. An understanding of where the river floods and where it does not, over cycles of flood frequency that individual lifetimes do not fully sample. This deep time knowledge, maintained through the oral tradition across the generations that each contributed their own portion of the full span of experience, is precisely what the Diné traditions about the Nahanni Valley represent. Not myths about a supernatural landscape, but descriptions of a natural landscape as it has behaved across a span of time long enough to reveal its full range of behavior. Descriptions that are encoded in narrative, because narrative is the medium through which oral traditions transmit information, but that contain real information about the real landscape. The specific descriptions in the Diné traditions about times when the valley was different from how it is now, when the hot springs were more or less active, when the river ran in different channels, when the canyon was navigable in ways that it is not today. All of these descriptions, if they are encoding real historical information, point toward a depth of knowledge about this landscape that scientific investigation is only now, with modern geological and archaeological tools, beginning to be able to verify and extend. And this brings us to the final and perhaps most significant observation about the Nahanni mystery. It is not a mystery about something hidden. It is not a mystery about something lost or concealed or suppressed. It is a mystery about the limits of the framework that most of the world uses to understand the past. A mystery about the gap between what the physical evidence of the valley records and what the conventional model of North American prehistory has been built to see. The evidence is not hidden. It is in the ground, in the cave, deposits in the sediments of the river terraces. The knowledge is not lost. It is maintained imperfectly, but essentially in the Dean oral tradition, and in the knowledge of the people who have kept the valley's secrets across the generations that the outside world ignored them. The gap is not in the evidence or in the knowledge, but in the framework, and the framework is slowly, under the sustained pressure of the evidence, beginning to change. The story of Canada's most mysterious valley is, in the end, a story about that change, about the slow, difficult, contested, intellectually exciting process by which scientific understanding expands to accommodate evidence that does not fit the models built by previous generations. It is a story that is ongoing, not concluded, a story whose most important chapters have not yet been written. But the setting is established. The characters, the scientists, and the DNA knowledge holders and the landscape itself are in place. The evidence is there, in the ground and in the oral tradition, waiting. And the investigation that will write the next chapters of this story will, when it comes, find a valley that has been patient for a very long time and that has a great deal to say. What the scientists found at Nahanni shocked them, not because the valley is impossible, but because it is extraordinary, not because the evidence is supernatural, but because it is natural in ways that go beyond the conventional model. Not because the findings are fabricated, but because they are real, and they are ancient, and they are pointing toward a past that is older and richer and more complex than the story we have been telling. That is the Nahanni mystery, and it is, by any measure, one of the most significant and most underappreciated scientific questions in the archaeology of the Americas. A question sitting in the walls of a canyon that the world has barely noticed, waiting for the attention and the investigation and the collaborative engagement that it deserves, and that it has been waiting for long enough. The canyon is there, the springs are warm, the caves hold their secrets, the Dean hold their knowledge, and the mystery, patient and deep and grounded in the real physical history of a real place, waits for the world to take it seriously. The river runs, the walls rise, and somewhere in the deep sediments of this extraordinary valley, the answers to the oldest questions about the human past in North America are preserved and waiting. This is Nahanni, this is what it holds, and this is why, when the people who have looked most carefully at what is there come back and speak about it, they speak in a tone unlike any other. Slower, lower, carrying something beneath the words that those who have been there recognize immediately, and that those who have not been there can only begin to understand from the evidence itself, laid out in the careful, patient, extraordinary record that the valley has been keeping for longer than anyone has yet been willing to fully count. The world will find out. The investigation will come, and the mystery will yield, as all true mysteries eventually yield when the proper tools are brought to bear on them, not to simple explanation, but to a deeper understanding. An understanding that makes the mystery not smaller but larger, because it reveals how much we did not know and how much there is to learn. About this valley, about this country, about the deep past of humanity in the Americas, about the relationship between a people and a landscape across the full span of deep time. That understanding is coming. The evidence is building toward it. The framework is slowly accommodating it, and the valley of the South Nahanni River, patient as the limestone that contains it, and ancient as the water that carved it, is ready. The question is whether we are. There is one more thing to say before we leave Nahanni, and it is the most personal thing in this entire account. It is about what it feels like to stand in that valley, at the base of those canyon walls, by the edge of that cold green river, knowing what the evidence suggests about the depth of human presence in this place. People have been here, long before any name that we have recorded was applied to this valley, long before any map showed these canyons, long before any written language existed to record what happened here. People sat by this river, probably where the thermal waters kept the banks unfrozen, and looked up at these walls, and fished these waters, and told each other stories about the valley, and what it meant, and what it held, and why it was different from anywhere else they knew. Those people are gone in the sense that any individual life is finite, and their individual voices are lost. But they are not gone in other senses. Their descendants are here, their knowledge is here, maintained across the generations in the oral tradition of the people who have kept faith with this landscape through everything that has been thrown at them. Their physical traces are here, in the sediments and the caves and the stone features, waiting to be found and read. And the landscape itself is here, changed across the thousands of years since the first people sat by this river, but continuous, the same canyon carved by the same water through the same rock, the same thermal springs warming the same inner valley, the same view of the sky from the same gorge, between the same walls. The landscape is the continuity between us and the people who were here first, the thread that runs from their time to ours through the unbroken physical existence of a specific place. Standing in that place, knowing that thread exists, knowing how long it is one of those experiences that changes the scale at which you think about human history. It makes 5,000 years of recorded civilization feel recent. It makes the human past feel vastly larger and more complex and more interesting than any history book has been built to contain. It makes the mystery not frightening but exhilarating, because it points toward how much there is still to understand. The scientists who have been there feel this. The Dean people who have known it longest feel it most deeply, in the bones of a connection that goes back further than individual memory can reach, but that is nonetheless real and sustaining. And anyone who goes there, who makes the difficult journey into the canyon and stands in the inner valley by the thermal springs, who looks up at walls that rise a kilometer above the river and feels the age of the stone under their feet, anyone who does that will understand without being told why people have been coming to this valley for as long as people have been in this part of the world. It is because the valley calls to something in the human experience that is older than culture and older than language and older even than the conscious recognition of what it is we are responding to. Something about the specific combination of shelter and warmth and resources and drama that this canyon provides. Something about the way the walls contain the world and make it manageable and legible. Something about the sound of the river and the warmth of the springs and the quality of the light in the canyon depths that is, for reasons we are still working to understand, extraordinarily right. The valley called. People came. They stayed. They built. They knew the place in ways that took generations to accumulate, and that the generations who came after them continued to build on, adding to the knowledge that the valley held about itself and about the people who lived in its shadow. That knowledge is the deepest mystery of Nahanni, not the headless bodies or the lost prospectors or the anomalous stone structures or the early radiocarbon dates, though all of those are real and all of them contribute to the picture. The deepest mystery is the depth of the human relationship with this specific landscape and what that depth contains and what it will reveal when we finally commit to understanding it. The investigation has barely begun. The valley has barely spoken, and what it has to say, when the proper questions are asked in the proper ways, with the proper combination of physical investigation and living knowledge, will be worth everything it takes to hear it. The South Nahanni River runs cold and green through its canyon, patient as the limestone that contains it, and ancient as the relationship between this land and the people who have known it longest. It will be running when the investigation comes in full, it will be running when the story is finally told in its entirety, and it will still be running long after the telling, carrying the sediment of the past downstream, mixing it with the waters of the Liard and the Mackenzie, and ultimately the Arctic Ocean, the ancient dissolved rock of an ancient canyon joining the water of the world. That is Nahanni. That is what it holds. That is why scientists who go there come back different from when they left. And that is why the mystery of this valley, when it is finally fully understood, will change the story we tell about the human past in North America more profoundly than any finding yet made in this territory. The world will find out. When the investigation comes, when the collaboration between the scientists and the Dean knowledge holders and the physical record of the valley itself finally reaches its full depth, when the story is told not in the partial, fragmented, contested way it can be told now, with the evidence incomplete and the frameworks inadequate and the investigation still ongoing, but in the full way that the evidence will eventually allow. That day is coming. The valley is ready. The evidence is there. And the mystery, patient and deep and real, is waiting. Let us go back into the specific evidence now, because there are aspects of the physical record at Nahanni that we have not fully explored, and they are important not just for what they tell us about the valley itself, but for what they suggest about the broader human past in this part of the world, and about the methods by which that past can be recovered. The paleoecological record of the Nahanni Valley, the record of past environments preserved in lake sediments and peat deposits in cave fill, has been the subject of investigation by palynologists and other specialists in paleoecological reconstruction. Pollen preserved in sediment cores from lakes in the valley and surrounding uplands provides a detailed picture of how the vegetation of the landscape has changed over time, and because vegetation changes are driven by climate, the pollen record provides an indirect record of past climatic conditions in the valley. The pollen record from Nahanni area sediment cores shows a sequence of vegetation changes across the past 15,000 years that is broadly consistent with what is known from other subarctic locations, but that has certain specific features that the researchers who have analyzed it have noted as unusual. Most significantly, certain intervals in the pollen record show vegetation assemblages that do not have modern analogs, combinations of plant species that do not coexist anywhere in the current subarctic landscape. These no-analog assemblages are known from other subarctic pollen records as well. They are a feature of the early post-glacial period, when the combinations of climate conditions that existed then had no exact parallel in the modern world, but the specific character and timing of the no-analog intervals in the Nahanni pollen record are slightly different from what is seen at comparable sites elsewhere in the region. The difference is consistent with, though not proof of, the hypothesis that the Nahanni Valley experienced a somewhat different climatic history than the surrounding region during the early post-glacial period, with the geothermal influence of the valley creating local conditions that diverge from the regional climate signal in ways that are preserved in the pollen record. If this is correct, it means that the biological environment of the valley was distinct from the surrounding landscape, not just in the modern sense, where the thermal influence of the springs is clearly visible, but during the critical period immediately following deglaciation, when the landscape was being recolonized, and the conditions of the valley may have provided a significant advantage for both biological and human communities seeking to establish themselves in the newly available landscape. The specific plant communities that the no-analog pollen assemblages represent would have been different from anything in the modern subarctic in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct from pollen alone. Pollen is taxonomically imprecise, and many plant species within the same genus are not distinguishable in the pollen record. but the broad outlines of the vegetation history can be reconstructed, and the picture that emerges for the early post-glacial Nahanni Valley is of a landscape that was unusually diverse and unusually productive relative to what the regional climate and latitude would predict, driven by the combination of early deglaciation, geothermal influence, and the specific topographic character of the canyon and surrounding uplands that created a range of microhabitat conditions in a relatively compact area. A landscape that is diverse and productive in this way is a landscape that supports dense and varied fauna, because diverse vegetation creates more niches and more food resources for a wider range of animal species than homogeneous vegetation. And a landscape with dense and varied fauna is a landscape that is attractive to human hunters and gatherers who can exploit a wider range of resources and who face less risk of resource failure in any single category than they would in a less diverse landscape. The paleoecological evidence for the productivity and diversity of the early post-glacial Nahanni Valley therefore contributes, as part of the cumulative case, to the argument that this valley would have been a particularly attractive location for early human settlement in the subarctic. Not proof of such settlement, but evidence that the conditions for it were favorable in ways that the surrounding landscape did not match. The charcoal record in the same sediment cores provides a different kind of information. Charcoal in lake sediments records fire history, the frequency and intensity of burning in the watershed draining into the lake over the period represented by the sediment core. The Nahanni charcoal record shows patterns of fire activity that have been analyzed in the context of both natural fire regimes and human-caused fire. Natural fire in the boreal and subarctic zones is driven primarily by lightning ignition during summer thunderstorms, and the patterns of natural fire, frequency, and intensity are well characterized from modern observations and from historical records. The charcoal record in certain Nahanni area cores shows episodes of elevated fire activity that do not correspond well to the patterns expected from lightning-caused fire. The timing of these episodes and their spatial pattern across the watershed are more consistent with patterns associated with human-caused burning in other subarctic archaeological contexts. This is indirect evidence, highly inferential, and the researchers who have analyzed the charcoal record are appropriately cautious about what conclusions can be drawn from it, but it is another piece of evidence that is consistent with the broader picture of early and sustained human presence in the valley. The pollen record of certain plant species known to increase in abundance in landscapes managed by human burning, species that respond positively to the kind of regular, low-intensity burning that indigenous peoples use to manage subarctic landscapes for game and plant resources, shows patterns in the Nahanni cores that are consistent with this kind of management in certain periods. The timing of the apparent management signal in the pollen record corresponds to the periods when the other lines of evidence suggest human presence was most intense in the valley. None of these lines of paleoecological evidence, taken individually, is sufficient to make a strong case for human management of the Nahanni landscape. Each individual piece of evidence has alternative natural explanations, but taken together as part of the cumulative case that includes the archaeological dates, the architectural anomalies, the trade goods, and the oral traditions, they contribute to a picture that is becoming increasingly difficult to explain without reference to sustained human presence and activity in the valley across a long period. The investigation that would allow this cumulative case to be properly evaluated has not been conducted. The paleoecological record has been partially sampled, not comprehensively analyzed. The charcoal and pollen data that exist are from a small number of cores that do not provide full spatial coverage of the valley and surrounding landscape. A comprehensive paleoecological study with systematic coring across the full range of lake and peat environments in the watershed would provide a much more detailed and spatially resolved picture of the environmental and fire history of the valley, and would allow the apparent human signal in the existing records to be either confirmed or explained away by natural processes. That study has not been done. The resources have not been available. The interest in the specific question of human management of the Nahanni landscape has not been sufficient to drive the investment, and so the evidence sits, partial and unresolved, in the published and unpublished literature of a small community of researchers who have spent time in the valley and who know that something is there, but who have not been able to mount the full investigation that would allow the full picture to emerge. Let us now return to the people, not the ancient people whose traces we have been following through the physical record, but the Dean people of the present, who are the living continuation of the human relationship with the Nahanni Valley that the physical evidence documents, because the story of Nahanni is not complete without understanding what the valley means to the people who are still here. The Decho Den, whose traditional territory includes the Nahanni watershed, have been through everything. The fur trade economy that restructured their traditional subsistence patterns. The mission schools that attempted to replace their languages and knowledge systems with those of colonial Christianity. The residential schools that removed children from their communities and subjected them to conditions that left generational trauma that still marks the communities today. The resource extraction that moved into their territory, the mining and logging, and eventually the oil and gas development that brought economic activity and disruption in equal measure. The establishment of the park and the World Heritage Site, which placed management frameworks on their traditional territory that were initially developed without meaningful consultation, and that required decades of negotiation and advocacy to bring into a form that acknowledged Diné rights and stewardship. Through all of this, the relationship with the valley has been maintained, not easily, not without cost, not without the damage that comes when the systems that transmit knowledge across generations are disrupted, and the specific knowledge that depends on those systems for its transmission is diminished, but maintained in the essential ways, in the ways that matter most. The Dene relationship with Nahanni is not simply a historical or cultural interest. It is a living relationship, expressed in the ongoing stewardship that Dene communities exercise over the park territory, in the land-based programs that bring Dean youth into the valley to learn the knowledge and practices associated with it, in the involvement of Dean knowledge holders in management decisions and research activities within the park, and in the continuing tradition of treating the valley as a place of particular spiritual and cultural significance that requires a different kind of engagement than ordinary territory. The Nahanni First Nation, a Dene community whose traditional territory centers on the valley, has been working for decades to ensure that the management of the park and the research conducted within it reflects and respects Dene values and Dene knowledge. The successes of this work are real. The park management framework has evolved substantially toward a co-management model that gives Dene communities a meaningful role in decisions about the park. Research protocols have been developed that require consultation with and consent from Dene communities before investigations in the park proceed. The discourse about the valley, both in the scientific literature and in public accounts, has increasingly acknowledged the primacy of Dene knowledge and Dene stewardship. But the work is ongoing because the structural inequalities that shape the relationship between First Nations communities and the institutions of the Canadian state, including the national park system and the universities and research funding bodies that support scientific investigation, are not easily or quickly reversed. The collaborative frameworks that would allow the full depth of DNA knowledge about the valley to be genuinely integrated with scientific investigation are still being built. The trust that is required for that integration, after the long history of the colonial relationship, takes time to develop and requires sustained good faith from the institutions that have historically held the power in this relationship. What would it look like if the full potential of the Nahanni collaboration were realized? It would look like DNA knowledge holders and scientific researchers working together from the beginning of the research design, with the research questions emerging from the dialogue between the two knowledge systems rather than being predetermined by the scientific framework alone. It would look like specific DNA knowledge about the valley, about the locations of significant sites, about the history of specific features, about the patterns of use and management that the traditions document, being used to direct the physical investigation toward the most promising locations and the most significant questions. It would look like the methods of the investigation being designed to accommodate the specific preservation conditions and depositional context that DNA knowledge identifies as significant, rather than being based solely on what the conventional archaeological toolkit is already designed to handle. And it would look like the results of the investigation being communicated not just in the conventional scientific publication channels, but in forms and venues that are meaningful and accessible to the DNA communities whose knowledge contributed to producing those results, and that allow those communities to continue to exercise their stewardship role over the knowledge that the investigation produces about their traditional territory. This kind of collaboration is not just ethically right, though it is that. It is scientifically productive in ways that collaboration structured along conventional power relationships is not, because it brings to the investigation knowledge that the conventional scientific toolkit cannot access independently, and that substantially increases the efficiency and the depth of the physical investigation. Knowing where to look, informed by DNA knowledge about significant locations, is more productive than conducting broad surveys without such direction. Understanding what the physical evidence means, informed by DNA oral traditions that have been building an interpretive framework for the valley's past for longer than any scientific investigation, is more productive than interpreting the physical evidence from first principles. The collaboration is worth doing. It has not yet been done at the depth that the significance of the place and the richness of both knowledge systems warrant. The barriers are real, but so is the potential. Now, I want to address something that has been implicit throughout this discussion, but that deserves direct statement. The question of what is at stake in understanding the Nahanni mystery. Why it matters beyond the purely academic interest in resolving scientific questions about the ancient past. The answer is not simple, but it is important. What is at stake is the complete story of who we are as a species and how we came to be where we are, not just in a geographic sense, but in a cultural and historical sense. The story of the human past in the Americas is not simply a matter of scientific interest. It is a matter of political and cultural significance, because the way we tell that story affects the way we understand the relationship between the indigenous peoples of the Americas and the lands that they occupied before European contact, and the way we understand that relationship affects the political and legal frameworks that govern indigenous rights in the present. If the conventional story in which the Americas were occupied by people who crossed from Asia 15,000 years ago and then developed independently until European contact is the complete story, then the relationship between indigenous peoples and their traditional territories is a relationship of long occupancy, but not of deep antiquity. If the emerging evidence from Nahanni and from sites across the continent suggests a much longer and more complex history of human presence in the Americas, then that relationship has a depth and a character that is different from what the conventional story implies, and the recognition of that depth and that character has implications for how indigenous rights and indigenous stewardship are understood and respected. This is not to say that the resolution of scientific questions about the timing of human arrival in the Americas should be driven by their political implications. Science follows the evidence, not the political preferences of any particular community, but the recognition that these scientific questions have political dimensions, that the way they are answered affects the way the world understands indigenous peoples and their relationship to their traditional territories, is important context for understanding why the conventional framework has been defended with such tenacity, and why the evidence that challenges it has sometimes been received with more skepticism than its quality warrants. The Dean people have known the Nahanni Valley for longer than any scientific investigation has been able to confirm. Their oral traditions say so. The physical evidence, incomplete as it is consistent with it, and the political and cultural significance of that deep relationship, the significance for how the Dean understand their own identity and how they assert their rights as the stewards of this territory, is not diminished by the scientific uncertainty about the precise depths of that relationship. The relationship is real, regardless of whether the archaeological investigation has confirmed its full extent. But the scientific investigation matters too, because it can contribute to the kind of documented, verifiable record that the political and legal systems require for the recognition of indigenous rights, and because understanding the full depth of the human relationship with the Nahanni Valley contributes to the complete story of the human past in North America, a story that belongs not just to the scientific community or to any particular national state, but to humanity as a whole. The Nahanni mystery is, in the end, a mystery about us, about who we are and how long we have been here and what we have done in the places where we have lived, about the depth of the connection between a people and a landscape when that connection has been maintained across the full span of human presence in a specific place, about the limits of the frameworks we have built to understand the past, and about the expanding edge of what the evidence is pushing those frameworks to accommodate. The scientists who have been shocked by what they found at Nahanni have been shocked by the evidence, but they have also been shocked, in the more personal sense, by the encounter with something that exceeds the categories they brought with them, something that is not just a scientific finding, but an experience of deep time, of the longness of the human story, of the intimacy of the connection between people and place across spans that the frameworks of modern civilization barely have vocabulary to describe. That experience, that encounter with the depth of what Nahanni holds, is what the account of the Nahanni mystery is ultimately about. Not the headless bodies or the contested dates or the anomalous architecture, but the deep, patient, extraordinary fact of a landscape that has held the story of a people for longer than most of the world has been willing to acknowledge. And the evidence, slowly accumulating in the sediments and the caves and the oral traditions, that the story is even longer than the bravest current estimates have proposed. The valley is there, the river runs, the canyon walls rise, the springs are warm, and the investigation, when it finally comes in full, will find that what has been waiting in the deep sediments of this extraordinary place is worth every bit of the effort and the patience and the collaboration and the willingness to revise the story that finding it requires. That is Nahanni, that is the mystery, and that is what the world will understand when it finally pays the full attention that this valley and the people who have kept faith with it across the full depth of the human past in this landscape have always deserved. There is something that happens in the Nahanni Valley that does not happen in other places in the same way. Something in the particular combination of elements that the canyon provides, the containment of the walls, and the sound of the river, and the warmth of the thermal springs, and the quality of the light that reaches the canyon floor at certain times of day, something that researchers who have spent time there describe as a quality of presence, a sense that the place is inhabited in ways that go beyond the physical presence of whatever people are actually there at any given moment, a sense of accumulated human time, of all the people who have stood in this canyon before, of the depth of the relationship between this specific place and the human beings who have known it. This is not mysticism. This is not the attribution of supernatural qualities to a natural landscape. It is a description of what it feels like to be in a place whose human history is long enough and whose physical character is striking enough, and whose preservation of the traces of that history is good enough to produce an experience of depth that ordinary landscapes do not produce. The same kind of experience you might have standing in an ancient cathedral, or on a battlefield that changed the course of history, or at the edge of a canyon that indigenous peoples have considered sacred for more generations than anyone has counted. The experience of a place that carries its history visibly, that shows its age, that makes the scale of time concrete in a way that abstract historical knowledge does not. The Nahanni Valley carries its history in the layers of limestone exposed in the canyon walls, each layer representing millions of years of geological time. It carries it in the cold green of the river that has been running since before any human being was born. It carries it in the warmth of the springs that have been keeping this specific microclimate alive through climate cycles that have repeatedly frozen and thawed the surrounding landscape. And it carries it in the sediments of its river terraces and the fill of its caves, where the physical traces of the people who have known this valley accumulate layer by layer across the full span of human presence here. To stand in that landscape and know what is in those layers, to understand even partially what the evidence suggests about the depth of the human story encoded in the sediments under your feet, is to feel something that changes the scale at which you think about the human past. Not just the past of this specific valley, or of the Northwest Territories, or of Canada, or even of North America, but the human past in general, the scale of it, the depth of it, the extraordinary fact that the story goes back so much further than the story we usually tell, and that most of what happened in those vast reaches of time before writing is encoded in places like this valley, in the physical record of the landscape, and in the living knowledge of the people who have maintained their relationship with that landscape across all the time that has passed. The scientists who found things at Nahanni that shocked them were shocked precisely because of this scale, because the evidence they found pushed them into confrontation with the depth of the human past in a way that their training had not fully prepared them for, because the conventional framework gives the impression that the important things happened recently in the period covered by written records and documented civilizations, and the evidence from Nahanni insists that the important things happened much earlier, in a time when no one was keeping records and when the scale of what was happening left traces only in the physical world and in the living memory of the people who were there. Those traces are real. They are there, and the understanding of what they mean, incomplete as it is one of the most important and most underappreciated contributions that the archaeology and geology and oral history of the Nahanni Valley can make to the broader human understanding of the past. The valley is ready. The evidence is there. The question is only when the world will be ready to hear what the valley has to say, when the investigation will come in full, when the collaboration between the physical sciences and the living knowledge of the Dean will reach the depth that the significance of the place deserves, when the story will be told, not in fragments and partial accounts and contested findings, but in the full version that the evidence will eventually allow. That telling is coming. The scientists are working toward it. The DNA knowledge holders are ready to contribute to it on their own terms. The valley itself is holding what it has always held, patient and old and rich with what has not yet been found. And when the story is finally told in full, when the investigation is complete and the findings are in, and the frameworks have been revised to accommodate what the evidence shows, the world will understand why those who have been there speak about this place in a different tone, why the canyon and the river and the hot springs and the deep sediments of this extraordinary valley have the power to change the scale at which a person thinks about the human story. Why Nahanni is not just a beautiful wilderness or an impressive geological feature or an important archaeological site, but something more than all of those things combined. It is one of the places where the deep past of humanity is most fully preserved and most accessible to investigation in both the physical record and the living tradition of the people who have never let go of their connection to it. It is a place where the story of the human past in North America is written in layers that no other archive has been keeping as long or as faithfully. It is a place that deserves the full weight of our curiosity and our respect and our scientific tools and our collaborative engagement with the knowledge systems that have been tending it across all the generations that have passed since the first people sat by this river and looked up at these walls. The South Nahanni River runs cold and green through the canyon. The walls rise a kilometer on each side. The hot springs warm the inner valley. The caves hold their secrets. The Dean hold their knowledge. The sediments hold their record. And the mystery, patient and deep and real and extraordinary, waits for the world to take it fully seriously. That is Nahanni. And that, finally, is what the scientists found there that shocked the entire world. There is a final category of evidence from the Nahanni region that we have not yet discussed in depth, and it is in some ways the most unusual of all the unusual things associated with this valley. It sits at the intersection of the physical sciences and the cultural knowledge of the Dean in ways that resist easy categorization, but that the people who have studied it most carefully agree cannot be dismissed as coincidence or misidentification. The Nahanni Valley has, for as long as there have been observers capable of recording the observation, exhibited anomalous electromagnetic phenomena, not dramatic, theatrical phenomena of the kind associated with paranormal claims, not lights in the sky or inexplicable sounds or any of the categories of experience that popular accounts of mysterious places tend to invoke, but subtle, measurable, instrumentally documented anomalies in the electromagnetic environment of certain parts of the valley that have been recorded by researchers using standard geophysical instruments and that have been noted in the scientific literature, however briefly and carefully qualified. The electromagnetic environment of any landscape is shaped by its geology. The distribution of electrically conductive and resistive materials in the subsurface, the presence of magnetite and other magnetic minerals, the flow of groundwater through conductive aquifer systems, all of these contribute to local variations in the electromagnetic field. In geothermal regions, the thermal alteration of rocks and the movement of mineralized hydrothermal fluids create particularly complex electromagnetic signatures because the chemical changes associated with high-temperature water, rock interactions systematically modify the electrical properties of the rocks through which the fluids move. The electromagnetic anomalies documented at certain locations in the Nahanni Valley are consistent with what would be expected in an active geothermal system. They reflect the distribution of altered rock and conductive fluids associated with the hot spring systems. In this sense, they are not surprising, and the electromagnetic evidence has been used by geologists studying the valley to map the extent and character of the geothermal system at depth. But certain of the electromagnetic anomalies are not fully explained by the geothermal model. There are locations in the valley where the electromagnetic signature is anomalous in ways that the known geothermal features do not account for, and where the specific character of the anomaly, the frequency and phase characteristics of the electromagnetic response, suggests the presence of subsurface conductive features that have not been identified by any other investigation. These unexplained anomalies are in some cases co-located with the archaeological sites that are most anomalous, the sites with the oldest dates and the most unusual material culture. The co-location is interesting but potentially coincidental, since both the archaeological anomalies and the electromagnetic anomalies are concentrated in the portions of the valley where the geothermal influence is strongest, and it may be the thermal influence itself that drove both the human occupation and the unusual electromagnetic environment. But the specific character of certain electromagnetic anomalies, occurring at locations and depths that the thermal alteration model does not straightforwardly predict, has been noted by geophysicists working in the region as requiring a more complete explanation than the available geological data provides. What might be causing these anomalies? The most straightforward geological explanations involve unmapped subsurface features, additional fault zones or intrusive bodies, or hydrothermal alteration zones that the existing geological mapping has not captured. The valley is complex enough geologically that additional unmapped structures are entirely plausible. Detailed geophysical survey with modern instrumentation would likely identify and characterize these structures and provide the explanation for the anomalies. But there is another possible explanation, one that is more speculative and that requires careful statement to avoid misrepresentation. Archaeological materials, specifically metallic objects concentrated in subsurface deposits, can produce electromagnetic anomalies that are detectable by standard geophysical instruments. The co-location of anomalous electromagnetic signatures with archaeological sites is a known and used feature of archaeological geophysics, which employs electromagnetic methods specifically because certain categories of archaeological material produce detectable signals. If the anomalous electromagnetic signatures at certain Nahanni sites are being generated in part by subsurface archaeological material, specifically by metallic objects in concentrations sufficient to produce a measurable signal, that would be both an explanation for the anomaly and an indication that the sites contain more material, and possibly more concentrated material, than the surface evidence suggests. Copper, which we have already established is present in the Nahanni archaeological record, is electrically conductive. A concentration of copper objects in a subsurface archaeological deposit could potentially produce an electromagnetic signature detectable by surface instrumentation if the concentration were sufficient. Whether the quantities of copper that the archaeological record suggests for the Nahanni sites would be sufficient to produce the kind of signals that have been documented is a question that requires careful modeling with known physical parameters. The modeling has not been done. The suggestion has not been formalized in the literature, but it is a possibility that the available evidence raises and that proper geophysical investigation conducted with appropriate archaeological questions in mind alongside the geological questions could potentially address. The electromagnetic evidence, like all the other lines of evidence we have discussed, is incomplete and unresolved. It contributes to the cumulative picture without definitively resolving it. It is one more thread in the web of anomalies that makes the Nahanni Valley the most scientifically significant and most scientifically frustrating location in subarctic Canada. Let us close now by bringing together all of the threads of this account into a final, integrated picture of what the Nahanni mystery is and what it represents. The valley is real. The canyon is extraordinary. The geothermal system is anomalous. The archaeological record is unusual and pushes the timeline of human presence in the valley further back than the conventional model predicts. The architectural features of certain sites are anomalous for the region and the period. The material culture shows connections to trade networks that span the continent. The paleoecological record shows evidence consistent with human management of the landscape. The electromagnetic survey data shows anomalies that are not fully explained by the known geology. And the oral traditions of the Dean people, who have been the stewards of this landscape since before any written record was kept, describe a valley with a history that is deeper and more complex than any scientific investigation has yet confirmed. All of these things are real. They are documented to varying degrees of completeness and certainty. They are genuine anomalies, things that do not fit the conventional model in ways that call for explanation. And the explanation that fits all of them best, the explanation that is most consistent with the full pattern of the evidence, is that the Nahanni Valley has been a place of unusual human significance for much longer than the conventional model of North American prehistory allows, and that the specific combination of physical features that make the valley unusual, its geothermal warmth, its potential nunatak status, its rich biological resources, its deep limestone with its cave system, and its extraordinary preservation conditions, are the reasons why. The mystery is not supernatural. It is not inexplicable. It is a scientific mystery grounded in physical evidence, amenable to scientific investigation, and pointing toward conclusions that would require the conventional framework to be revised. The revision it would require is significant, but not unprecedented. The history of science is full of significant revisions to established frameworks, revisions that seemed impossible before the evidence made them necessary and obvious afterwards. The Nahanni revision, when it comes, will be one of those. It will say that the human story in North America is older and deeper and more complex than the 20th century framework allowed. It will say that the people who were here before European contact were not recent arrivals, but long residents of an ancient landscape with a depth of knowledge and a sophistication of relationship to the land that the conventional image of pre-contact indigenous peoples has systematically underestimated. And it will say that the valley of the South Nahanni River in the Northwest Territories of Canada is one of the places where the evidence for that old, deep, complex story is most richly preserved and most waiting to be found. That is the Nahanni mystery. That is what the scientists found there, and what they were shocked by, and what the world will eventually understand in full. The river runs, the canyon walls rise, the springs are warm, the evidence waits, and the story, patient and deep and extraordinary, is ready to be told. We began this account in a valley that most of the world does not know by name. We end it with the understanding that the anonymity of the valley is not a reflection of its significance, but of the limits of the world's attention. Nahanni is one of the most important places in North America for understanding the deep human past of the continent. It is one of the most extraordinary landscapes on the planet, in the physical sense of its geological drama and in the historical sense of what it holds in its sediments and its caves and its oral traditions. And it is a place whose full story has not yet been told, because the investigation has not yet been completed, because the frameworks that shape what we are able to see have not yet been fully revised to accommodate what the evidence is showing. That revision is coming. The investigation will come. And when it does, when the full depth of what the Nahanni Valley holds is finally revealed to the world will understand why the people who have spent time there speak about it the way they do. In a lower tone, a slower tone, with something underneath the words that is not quite fear and not quite awe, but partakes of both, and that is, in the end, the appropriate human response to the encounter with deep time in its most accessible and most extraordinary form. That is what Nahanni holds. That is why it matters, and that is why the scientists who found things there were shocked, and why the world, when it finally pays the full attention this valley deserves, will be shocked too. The South Nahanni River runs cold and green and ancient through its canyon. It will be running when we finally understand what it has been keeping. It will be running long after that understanding changes the story we tell about the human past. And it will be running, patient and cold and extraordinary, as long as there is a canyon for it to run through and a world to receive what the canyon has to say. That is Nahanni. And that, in the end, is enough. There are things that science does well and things that science does poorly, and one of the things that science does poorly is acknowledge the significance of what it doesn't yet know. The conventional presentation of North American prehistory gives the impression of a settled story, one in which the major questions have been answered and the framework is essentially correct, even if the details remain to be filled in. The Nahanni evidence is a reminder that this impression is false. The major questions have not been answered. The framework is not essentially correct in the ways that matter most, and the details that remain to be filled in are not minor details but foundational questions about when and how the human story in the Americas began. The people who went into the Nahanni Valley and found things they could not explain were doing science in the truest sense, following the evidence wherever it led, reporting what they found, acknowledging what they did not understand, the institutional response to their findings, the skepticism and the resistance and the qualified acknowledgement and the slow uptake in the broader literature is also science, or at least the human dimension of science, the part where established frameworks and institutional interests and personal reputations interact with the evidence in ways that do not always produce the most rapid or the most complete incorporation of new findings. Both of these are real. Both are part of the story of Nahanni, and understanding both is essential for understanding why the mystery persists, why the investigation has not been completed, and why the findings that have been made have not yet produced the revision of the conventional model that the evidence seems to call for. The persistence of the mystery is not a failure of science. It is a measure of the complexity of the questions that Nahanni raises and the difficulty of the evidence that would be needed to answer them definitively. Complex questions in difficult environments with evidence that requires expensive and logistically challenging investigation to recover are exactly the kind of questions that take the longest to answer and that generate the most controversy and the most institutional resistance when the evidence that is recovered does not fit the established frameworks. Nahanni is one of those questions, one of those places, and the answer to the question it poses, when it comes, will be worth every bit of the difficulty and the time and the controversy that getting there has required and will continue to require. The world's most mysterious places are mysterious not because they are supernatural, but because they contain evidence of the past that the present has not yet fully understood. The tools for understanding that evidence exist or can be developed. The knowledge systems that hold additional information about the past of those places are living and accessible. The investigation that would move from mystery toward understanding is possible. What is required is the will to conduct it, the patience to do it properly, the resources to sustain it over the time it requires, and the willingness to accept the conclusions it produces, even when those conclusions require revising the stories we have been telling about the past. Nahanni has all of the evidence needed to produce conclusions. It needs the will and the patience and the resources and the acceptance. When those arrive, the mystery will yield, not completely, not all at once, but progressively, as the investigation deepens and the evidence accumulates and the understanding grows. And the world will find out what the valley has been keeping, what the scientists who went there found and could not fully explain. What the Dean people have known in forms different from, but complementary to what the scientists have documented. What the limestone and the sediment and the cold water and the warm springs have been preserving across the full span of human presence in this extraordinary canyon. The story is longer than we have been telling it. The past is deeper than the framework has been built to see. And the valley, patient and old and rich with evidence, is ready to show us how much deeper it goes. That is the Nahanni mystery. That is what waits there. And that is why when the world finally looks closely at what this remote, extraordinary canyon in the Northwest Territories of Canada holds, it will be shocked, not by the supernatural, but by the natural, by the sheer depth and antiquity and complexity of the human story preserved in a landscape that has been keeping its secrets quietly and faithfully for longer than anyone has yet been willing to count. The river runs, the mystery waits, and the story, the true and deep and extraordinary story of what happened in this valley across the full span of human time, is ready to be told. We began with a valley that the world does not know well enough. We end with the understanding that knowing it better is one of the most important things that North American archaeology can do. Not for the spectacle of it, not for the sensation of finding something that upsets a comfortable narrative, but because the truth about the human past in the Americas is important in ways that go beyond any individual finding or any individual site. And Nahanni is one of the places where that truth is most fully encoded and most ready to be recovered. The scientists who found things there were shocked because the evidence was better than they expected. Older, more complex, more anomalous in ways that resisted easy explanation, more consistent with a picture of the human past in this valley that exceeded what the conventional model allowed. They were shocked in the way that scientists are shocked when the world is more interesting than their models predicted, which is the best kind of shock, the kind that drives the next investigation and the next revision and the next closer approach to the truth. That approach is ongoing. The investigation continues. The evidence accumulates, and the valley, patient and cold and extraordinary, keeps what it has always kept and waits. The South Nahanni River doesn't care about our models or our frameworks or our timelines. It has been running since long before any of those things existed, and it will be running long after they have been revised beyond recognition. It runs through a canyon carved by its own past work, through limestone laid down in ancient seas, past walls that carry the record of time in their layers. It runs past the locations where people have stood and looked at those walls and felt the depth of the past in the way that only specific, physical, real places can convey. And it carries in its cold green current the dissolved minerals of that limestone, the ancient sediment of the ancient land, out through the Liard River and the Mackenzie, and into the Arctic Ocean, where it joins the water of the world and becomes part of the endless circulation that connects all the water on earth to all the other water and to the sky, and the rain and the rivers and the lakes and the oceans that have been cycling since long before, the first human being stood at the edge of any of them and looked out at the horizon. We are part of that. The human story is part of the Earth story. The mystery of Nahanni is a chapter in that larger story that we have not yet fully read. But we are reading it, slowly, carefully, with the humility that the depth of what we do not yet know requires, and the confidence that the tools we are developing will eventually allow us to read it fully. The valley waits, the evidence waits, and the story, patient and deep and real, waits for the world to be ready to hear it. That day is coming, and when it comes, what the world hears will be worth the wait. Everything in the evidence of this extraordinary valley suggests so. The scientists who have been there know it. The Dean people who have always been there know it in a deeper way. And the valley itself, in the quiet, physical way that landscapes know things, through the evidence preserved in their sediments and their stones and their living systems, is ready. The South Nahanni River runs, the mystery endures, and the truth waits, patient as limestone and as cold as glacier water, and as warm as the springs that keep this valley alive, for the day when the world finally comes to hear it in full. That is Nahanni. That is the mystery. And that, for now, is all that can be said about it with the honesty that this extraordinary place deserves. There is one final observation about Nahanni that this entire account has been building toward, and it is the most important observation of all, the one that gives everything else its meaning and its weight. The Nahanni Valley is not special because it is exotic. It is not special because it holds something that no other place on earth holds. It is special because it holds something that many places on earth hold, but that it holds with unusual clarity and unusual depth and unusual completeness. It holds the record of the human past, specifically the record of the human past in North America during the periods that the conventional story has not adequately accounted for. It holds that record in a landscape that has preserved it better than most comparable landscapes have, because of the specific combination of geological and physical conditions that make the valley what it is. And the reason that is important, the reason that what scientists found at Nahanni has shocked the world in the ways that this account has described, is that the record it holds is inconsistent with the story that most of the world has been telling about the human past in the Americas. It is inconsistent with the timeline, inconsistent with the picture of who was here and how they lived and what they knew and what they built. Inconsistent with the scale of the human presence in this part of the world before the arrival of Europeans. The story that Nahanni tells, the story encoded in its sediments and its caves and its oral traditions and its anomalous architecture and its ancient trade goods, is a story of people who were here longer and more continuously and with more sophistication and more knowledge and more connection to the world beyond their immediate landscape than the conventional story has acknowledged. It is a story of the depth of the human relationship with this continent. Not a recent relationship, not a relationship of newcomers who arrived 15,000 years ago and spread across an empty continent, but a deep, ancient, complex relationship between specific peoples and specific landscapes that goes back further and runs deeper and has more layers than the version we have been taught. That is what the scientists found at Nahanni. Not aliens, not lost civilizations in the popular sense, not supernatural phenomena of any kind, but the deep human past, real and physical, and documented in the evidence of the physical landscape, telling a story that the conventional framework has not been adequate to contain. The shock is appropriate. The story is better than the conventional version. Older, deeper, more complex, more worthy of the full scientific and cultural attention that the evidence has been waiting for, and that this valley and the people who have always known it are ready to receive. The investigation will come. The story will be told, and the Nahanni Valley, patient and ancient and extraordinary, will be understood at last in something approaching its full depth and significance. Not as a legend, not as a mystery in the supernatural sense, but as what it actually is. One of the most remarkable places in North America, holding one of the most important records of the deep human past on the continent, waiting for the world to be ready to understand what that record says. The river runs cold and green through the canyon. The walls rise a kilometer above. The springs keep the inner valley warm. The caves hold their record. The Dean hold their knowledge. And the evidence, patient and real and deep beyond anything the conventional story has made room for, waits for the investigation that will finally recover it in full. That is Nahanni. That is why it matters. And that, in the end, is why the scientists who went there came back, speaking in lower and slower tones, carrying something in their understanding of this place that the tools of the conventional framework could not fully contain. The world will understand, the investigation will come, and what it finds will change the story of the human past in North America in ways that nothing else currently available has the depth and the completeness to change. That is the Nahanni mystery. That is what it holds. And that is why, for anyone who understands what the evidence means and what it is pointing toward, this remote canyon in the Northwest Territories of Canada is one of the most important and most extraordinary places in the world. The South Nahanni River runs. The mystery waits. The story is ready to be told. And the world, when it is ready to listen, will find that it was worth waiting for. Worth every bit of the effort and the patience and the revision of everything it thought it knew. The valley has always known this. The Dean have always known this. And the evidence, slowly, patiently, in the only way that physical evidence can communicate, has been saying it all along. Now we know it too. Or we are beginning to. And the beginning is enough to understand why the scientists were shocked, and why the world will be shocked when the full story is finally told, and why Nahanni, this cold and extraordinary canyon in the subarctic of Canada, deserves every bit of the attention and the wonder and the serious scientific engagement that this account has tried to give it. The river runs, the mystery endures, and the story waits, patient as deep time for the day when it will be fully heard. And yet there is still something more to say, something that the account of specific sites and specific findings and specific debates does not fully capture. Something about what it means to have a place like Nahanni in the world at all. A place where the deep past is not only recoverable in principle, but is actually being recovered, fragment by fragment, through the patient work of researchers who keep going back despite the difficulty and the expense and the institutional resistance and the inadequate funding. A place where the living knowledge of indigenous people and the physical evidence in the ground are both available, both real, both waiting for the collaborative engagement that would allow them to speak to each other in ways that neither can fully speak alone. Such places are rare, the combination of physical conditions that preserve evidence across deep time, the presence of living communities who have maintained their relationship with the landscape across that same deep time, the geological and environmental character that makes the landscape itself a participant in the mystery. All of these together are extraordinary. Nahanni has them. This specific canyon in the Northwest Territories of Canada, this place that most of the world has never heard of, has all of them. That is why it matters. Not just as an archaeological site, not just as a geological curiosity, not just as the location of a legend about headless bodies and missing prospectors, but as one of the rare places in the world where the full depth of the human past is accessible, where the investigation of that past is possible, and where the results of that investigation could genuinely change the way the world understands itself and its history. The scientists who have been there know this. The dean who have always been there know this more deeply. And the evidence in all its anomalous, contested, incomplete, extraordinary richness knows it in the only way that physical evidence knows anything, by being what it is, by sitting there in the limestone and the sediment and the organic material of the cave deposits, being older than the models predicted and more complex than the frameworks allowed, and more connected to the broader world than the conventional picture of pre-contact subarctic life suggested. The world will find out. The investigation will come. And when it does, when the canyon finally gives up the full measure of what it holds, the world will understand why the people who have looked most carefully at what is there speak about this valley in a different tone than they use for anywhere else they have worked. Lower, slower, with something underneath the words that you would recognize immediately if you heard it. The tone of people who have encountered the deep past in one of its most complete and most accessible and most extraordinary forms. The tone of people who have found something that the frameworks they brought with them could not fully contain. And the tone, above all, of people who know that what they found is real and old and important, and waiting for the world to be ready to understand what it means. The South Nahanni River runs through its canyon. The mystery endures. And the world, when it finally comes to hear what the valley has to say, will find it was worth the wait. Everything in the evidence of this extraordinary place suggests so. And the evidence, patient and cold and deep and real, is never wrong. That is Nahanni, and that is enough. Before we part, there is one thing worth returning to. The beginning. The moment when a researcher first rappelled into a cave in the canyon wall and found something on the floor of a chamber that did not belong there by any calculation that the conventional model of North American prehistory would support. The moment when the dates came back from the laboratory and the researcher looked at the numbers and looked at them again and then sat quietly for a while, understanding that the numbers were correct and that what they meant was going to require a conversation that the field was not yet ready to have. That moment happened. It was real. The researcher was real. The cave is real. The dates are real. And what they mean, in the full context of everything else that has been found in and around the Nahanni Valley, is real in ways that the world has not yet fully absorbed. The shock is real. The mystery is real. And the story, the true and complete story of what humans have been doing in this extraordinary canyon across the full span of deep time, is real and waiting and ready. The South Nahanni River runs. The world will listen, and the mystery will yield, as all true mysteries eventually yield, to the patient, careful, collaborative work of understanding. That is Nahanni. That is what the scientists found. And that is why this place, this cold and extraordinary canyon in the Northwest Territories of Canada, matters more than the world yet knows. The canyon holds what the canyon holds. The springs keep the valley warm through the subarctic winter. The caves preserve what they have always preserved. The dean hold the knowledge that the generations have passed down. And the mystery, patient and deep and grounded in the physical reality of one of the most extraordinary landscapes on the continent, waits for the day when the world finally takes it fully seriously. That day is coming. The evidence demands it. The valley deserves it. And the story, the true and full and extraordinary story of what happened in this canyon across the full depth of human time in North America, is ready to be told.